হ্যাঁ স্যার, চালু করছি এবার।
কি রেকর্ডিং?
না না, ওই ইউটিউবটা।
ও আচ্ছা আচ্ছা।
হ্যাঁ, চালু হয়ে গেছে।
সুশান্ত কোন দিকে হাওয়া হয়ে গেল রে? হুম দাও এই ও নাম্বার বন্ধ হয়ে গেল, বন্ধ হয়ে গেল। আর চালু আছে ভিডিওটা। কোনটা?
প্রসেনজিৎ দা
প্রিন্সিপাল জয়েন করেছে।
ভালো তো প্রসেনজিৎ দা?
প্রিন্সিপাল স্যার জয়েন করেছে। তাহলে আমরা 3টায় শুরু করে দেবো তো?
তাই তো কথা ছিল।
তাহলে ডট 3টাতে শুরু করে দেবো, তাহলে রেকর্ডিং তখন থেকে শুরু হয়ে যাবে।
হ্যাঁ, দেখে নিতে হবে সাগর বাবু ভিসি স্যার জয়েন করেছেন কিনা।
হ্যাঁ, ভিসি স্যারকে ফোন করতে বলে সে বললো। স্বপনদা মাইক্রোফোনটা অফ করে রাখুন।
হ্যাঁ করছি।
সাগরদা, সাগরদা, সাগরদা আছেন? সাগরদা?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ, বলছি অলোক বাবুকে একবার লিঙ্কটা পাঠান, স্যার খুঁজে পাচ্ছেন না লিঙ্ক, মেল করুন।
ঠিক আছে, এখানে আমি তো করছি না, জয়েন করছি।
স্যারকে তো মেল করেছিলাম, খুঁজে পাচ্ছেন না।
বলছে মেল এসেছে কিন্তু ইয়ে যায়নি। আচ্ছা আমি দেখছি, আমি পাঠাচ্ছি।
হ্যাঁ আপনি পাঠান, আমি তো জয়েন করাচ্ছি।
একজন দুবার জয়েন করেছে।
স্যার জয়েন করেছে, শুরু করে দিন। ওয়েলকাম স্যার।
স্যার আপনার
এমিলি ম্যাডাম শুরু করে দিন।
আচ্ছা ভাইস
ওটা
চ্যান্সেলর
কেটে নিচ্ছি তাহলে।
শর্মিলা দি স্যারকে একবার ফোন করুন, ভাইস চ্যান্সেলর স্যারকে।
আর স্যার আমি তাহলে ভাইস চ্যান্সেলর স্যারকে একবার ফোন করবো এখন। আচ্ছা
করে নাও, ফোন করে নাও।
হ্যাঁ ঠিক আছে।
শাওনুর বাবু জয়েন করেছেন।
স্যার
হ্যাঁ।
ওয়েলকাম স্যার।
স্যার জয়েন করছেন।
আচ্ছা আমরা কি শুরু করে দেবো স্বাগত দা?
হ্যাঁ স্যার জয়েন করুক, স্যার তো আছে, মনে হয় প্রিন্সিপালের পারমিশন নিয়ে শুরু করে দিন।
হ্যাঁ স্যার, প্রিন্সিপাল স্যার, মে আই স্টার্ট? প্রিন্সিপাল স্যার
আছে আছে প্রিন্সিপাল স্যার আছে তো।
ওকে স্টার্ট।
Okay. A very good afternoon to all. I am Emily Rumi, Assistant Professor, Department of History, Sripat Singh College. I heartily welcome you all to the two-day international webinar on globalization, democracy, and nationalism, past, present, and future of India, organized by the Department of History and IQAC, Sripat Singh College, in collaboration with the Department of History, University of Kalyani. On behalf of the Department of History, I welcome Professor Manoj Kumar Sannal, Honorable Vice Chancellor, University of Kalyani, Dr. Shamsuzzaman Ahmed, Principal, Sripat Singh College, our resource persons, Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh, Department of History, University of Kalyani, Professor Shahanur Rahman, Department of History, Northeastern Hill University, Dr. Syed Ali Nadim Rezavi, Professor, Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University, and Dr. Milindo Banerjee, Lecturer, School of History, University of St. Andrews, UK. I welcome all the participants, my fellow colleagues, my dear students, and all those who have joined us on this virtual platform. I take the opportunity to announce that Professor Manush Kumar Shanmal, Honorable Vice Chancellor, will deliver the inaugural speech. I invite Professor Manush Kumar Shanmal, Honorable Vice Chancellor, to deliver the inaugural speech. Has sir joined?
স্যার জয়েন করেনি এখন।
Okay. We can wait for.
এখনো করেনি, আপনি আমার প্রিন্সিপাল থেকে শুরু করে দিন নাকি?
I request the participant to unmute yourself and turn off your video so that we can run this program smoothly. I invite our principal to give the welcome address. Sir?
Most welcome all present here on this platform for attending the international webinar on globalization, democracy and nationalism, past, present and future in India, organized by our most vibrant department, history department. I feel proud of them, as in this pandemic situation, our history department has already made a history which is very commendable for organizing so many webinars and lecture series in the meantime in this new normal situation. So webinar is also going to be another success story for the history department. I have already noticed that our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Kalyani University, Professor Manush Kumar Shanmal, joined this program. First of all, I express my heartfelt gratitude to our beloved Vice Chancellor, Kalyani University, Professor Manush Kumar Shanmal, for giving his kind consent to deliver the inaugural speech for this seminar organized by our history department. So we are very much thankful to him for his kind gesture. Here Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh is present, Professor History Department, Kalyani University. We think Professor Ghosh as a part and parcel of our college, and we are very fortunate enough to have his advice for any kind of academic pursuit. So there is no question to express thanks, but we are always grateful to Professor Ghosh as a friend, philosopher and guide to our young colleagues. I welcome Professor Syed Ali Nadim Rizvi, Professor History Department, Aligarh Muslim University. Our young colleague announced the program of today. Emily Rumi is a student of Aligarh Muslim University, and Professor Gulfishan Khan attended a seminar organized by our this department history physically before this new normal or pandemic situation. I personally visited several times Aligarh Muslim University, and once I personally met Professor Irfan Habib. I think, like many others, the living legendary historians of our time. So, from this background, I can say there is a living contact with Aligarh Muslim University, especially the history department. So, once again, I express my heartfelt gratitude to Professor Saeed Ali Nadim Razvi for attending this webinar as a resource person. Mr. Dr. Milinda Banerjee, lecturer, School of History, University of St. Andrews, UK. I welcome Dr. Banerjee and express our gratitude for participating in this webinar as a resource person. I personally became some kind of nostalgia expressed having seen the surname or title Banerjee, Bengali nostalgia, but I don't know. But he is a good friend, I think, and his lecture will be very much interesting to all other participants, especially our students. Last, not the least, our beloved friend, Dr. Sanurur Rahman. He knows us very much and we feel proud of him. He is from Nehu, Northeastern Hill University, Department of History. I am very much thankful to him as our program schedule is prepared. Most probably he is not present today, or I don't know. Tomorrow he will deliver the lecture. And I am thankful to Dr. Subhash Biswas, head of the department, History Department, Kalyani University, for his initiative, for collaboration, for organizing this seminar. I express my sincere thanks to Dr. Surmila Dr. Bonik, head of the department of our history department, for her sincere effort to organize such a webinar and make all the contacts by heart with the different resource persons and other members of the department, Emily Rumi, Sapon Kumar Sakar, and others members of the department. They have worked together to make success this seminar. So far, the title of the seminar is concerned. I think personally I am not a student of social science, but I think the three key words, globalization, democracy, and nationalism, this practically requires three individual days to organize this. That is, these are very these words are very much known to the student of the social science, but these words has a very much significance in our day-to-day life, not only national life, in our personal life also. So I think the lecture of the resource persons will enrich our beloved students. So I think this seminar will be very much successful, and our initiative will be beneficial to our students particularly. Once again, I conclude my this short address mentioning that Professor Manoj Kumar Sarnal is present here. We are always express our thanks to sir. Before this event, we have also got him to inaugurate this seminar. Now I over to Emily just to address sir to introduce. Emily.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your words, and thank you again and again for being there, as you have always extended your hands to organize such academic events. Thank you, sir. Now, on behalf of the Department of History, Sripat Singh College, I welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Manoj Kumar Sarnal, and we are honored that you have given your consent and you joined us and will deliver the inaugural speech. Sir does not need any introduction. Therefore, I invite Sir Professor Manoj Kumar Sarnal, Honorable Vice Chancellor, to deliver the inaugural speech. Sir, over to you.
স্যার আনমিউট করুন।
Sir, please unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. Professor Dr. Shamsujjaman Ahmed, the principal of this college, Sripat Singh College. Dr. Emily, Dr. Shormila Datta Bhumik, and my colleague, Dr. Alok Ghosh, Dr. Subhash Bishwas, all the dignitaries present join here, distinguished guests, speakers, my dear students, ladies and gentlemen. I am really happy to inaugurate this very important webinar organized by the Department of History, Sripat Singh College, and our Department of History in our university. So it is really unfortunate that we cannot visit your campuses because of this pandemic situation and the restriction. So we have to join in online mode. So this topic chosen by the IQAC cell of the Sripat Singh College and the History Department of our university, globalization, democracy, and nationalism. We know the globalization, democracy, nationalisms, and the relationship among them have been the subjects of debate among the researchers in the international relationship discipline and also in the history discipline. These concepts have an important position in our contemporary world. Their importance lies in the creation of modern societies and national states and their role in a world and in our country also, in which interdependencies has increased. So I sincerely hope this two-day webinar will address all these terms that Dr. Ahmed mentioned. These are the very important terms in the social science. So, and explore all the relationships, all the importance of these terms in this 2 days webinar. And ultimately, I hope this conference will significantly contribute to an atmosphere of free exchange of ideas, develop new dimension of research, and encourage young researchers particularly, and faculties and students for greater interaction. I sincerely congratulate all the committee members of this webinar, organizing committee members, patron, our departmental colleagues for organizing such type of webinar. And I take this opportunity to convey the thanks to the principal of this college for allowing this webinar in the colleges before the puja, and I wish the event a grand success. Thank you all.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And once again, I express my sincere regards to you that in spite of your hectic schedule, you make it possible to be a part of this event, and we will remember this forever. Thank you, sir, once again. Thank you. Now I invite Dr. Sharmila Datta-Bonik, head of the department, the history department, to deliver the introductory speech. Sharmila Di?
Am I audible?
Yes.
A very good afternoon to everyone. It is a great moment for us to welcome you all on this auspicious occasion, and I feel blessed for the presence of our beloved Vice Chancellor, Dr. Manush Kumar Sannal, who has given us time in his busy schedule. I won't say much words, rather we hear from our speakers just a few words. As you know, the theme of the theme chosen for discussion in this webinar is globalization, democracy and nationalism, past, present and future of India. The theme is very relevant and its scope is wide. For the last few years, scholars of different disciplines have discussed the theme from different perspectives. Today, we, the Department of History, have chosen the theme to discuss from historical perspective. Eminent scholars will speak on different aspects. As for example, eminent speaker, Professor Alok Ghosh will give his keynote address. Our another noted speaker, Syed Ali Nadim Rizvi, will speak on the concept of India as given by Amir Khusru. And distinguished speaker Dr. Milinda Banerjee will be discussing on decolonized political thought, rethinking the roots of Indian democracy. And respected Sir Dr. Shanurur Rahman will speak on pluralism and globalism on the light of Sufism. So I think we need not waste much time. I think we will rather start our technical session. Okay, thank you, Emily.
Thank you, Dr. Sharmila Datta-Bonik, for your introductory speech. Now I invite Dr. Subhash Vishwas, head of the Department of History, University of Kalyani, to say a few words introductory speech.
Welcome to everybody present here. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Manush Kumar Sannal, Professor Principal of Sripat Singh College, our Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh, present. Hello.
Yes.
শোনা যাচ্ছে
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা I am outside now, so it is a problem to speak for me, to give a space for me. I am in a hospital now. Anyway, I welcome everybody present here, our resource persons and participants. few days before, Emily Rumi and Shurmila Dattabonik contacted to us for this seminar to organize a webinar in collaboration with Kalyani University, Department of History, Kalyani University. After this discussion, it is going to be organized today. I hope it will got a great success after today's presentation. I thank everybody because I am hello.
Yes.
I am now in a hospital, so I could not able to speak my lengthy. Hello,
Yes.
hello.
হ্যাঁ শোনা যাচ্ছে
I am outside my house, so I cannot. I cannot talk more now. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Subhash Bishas, and I should really be grateful to you that you have given your consent for collaborating with us, and I really believe that we'll be able to reach to our point. I have just been informed that Sri Bobin Kumar Pattanayok, IQAC coordinator, who had to deliver a few words or introductory speech. Actually, for some unavoidable reason, he is outside, so he can't join us. But he has conveyed his wishes for us, and I say thank you to Sri Bobin Kumar Pattanayok. Maybe he will join tomorrow. Now I will move to the technical session, and in this session we are honored that Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh will deliver the keynote address. Though Professor Ghosh does not need any introduction, but I will introduce him briefly. Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh presently is an associate professor and former head of the department in the Department of History, University of Kalyani. Before joining the University of Kalyani, he had taught in the Kalimpong College, University of North Bengal. His areas of interest are the refugee studies and environmental and economic history of modern India. For many years, he was an associate editor of Anushtup, a Bengali journal of history. He edited a number of books and wrote many research articles. Bengal, Permanent Settlement to Operation Borga is one of his important publications. With this brief introduction, I invite Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh to deliver the keynote address. Sir, over to you.
শোনা যাচ্ছে audible?
Yes, sir, audible.
Good afternoon to everybody. It's my pleasure and honor that I have been invited to deliver the keynote address in this international seminar. First, I convey my gratitude and thanks to our respected Vice Chancellor, Professor Manoj Kumar Sannal. I know him for long years, and every time in any academic exercise, he encouraged us all in so many ways. It is really a fortune that he has been present in this seminar and he has inaugurated it. I'm really grateful and thankful to him. I'm also very much thankful to the principal of Sripat Singh College, Dr. Shamsujjaman Ahmed. I know him also for long years, and he's equally encouraging for any academic programs, webinars, and really for the last, in this lockdown period also, it is under his leadership that the Sripat Singh College has done commendable job in organizing so many webinars, so many workshops, etc. The organizers of Sripat Singh College, most of them are my students, and like my students, my other friends in that college and my colleagues in the Department of History. The head of the department, Shubhash, he is also my student. So I think formal thanks are not needed for them, but yet I'm very fortunate that I have got such colleagues and such students. So with this expression of my gratitude, I start my keynote address for this webinar. Actually, this is a very, very modern and broad theme, and in a short span of time, it is very difficult to cover all the aspects of such a theme. But yet, I will try, in this short spell of time, I will try to touch upon some important features of the theme. I will discuss it in a general perspective, and I hope that the speakers, the renowned speakers, the scholars who will participate in this webinar afterwards, they will deal in particular aspects, in details, in some themes related to this broad frame, and they will situate India in this broad theme properly, I hope. Actually, it is also a lesson to us that we are utilizing technology. We are utilizing online facilities for contacting with so many persons at a time and for organizing these webinars. And this development is also a part of globalization process, this technological advancement. The world, I would rather speak in both the languages, because I know that there are some students attending this webinar. In some cases, some Bengali versions would be helpful to them. The world we live today is marked by, I think, three dominant features: the enormous and continuing acceleration of men's ability to change it by means of technology. This is the first thing. The second thing is standardization of life by maximization of production and consumption of inorganic commodities. And the third feature is collectivization of capital throughout the world and redistribution of denationalized labor, both at the desk and in the field. একটা অদ্ভুত জগতে আমরা, একটা অদ্ভুত বলবো না, একটা নতুন জগতে আমরা বাস করছি। এই জগতে ক্রমাগত প্রযুক্তির উন্নয়ন ঘটছে। আমরা প্রথমে লক্ষ্য করব যে একটা সময় আমরা পেরিয়ে এসেছি যখন সায়েন্টিফিক ইনভেনশনস খুব ইম্পর্টেন্ট ছিল, নতুন নতুন বিজ্ঞানের ল অফ নেচার আবিষ্কার করা, জীবন এবং পরিবেশের নতুন নতুন নিয়ম বার করা, যেটাকে রুল অফ ল অফ নেচার বলে, এবং বিজ্ঞানের নানা রকমের পদ্ধতি আবিষ্কার করা, ইনভেনশনস। But now we are living in a world of technology. বিজ্ঞানের পদ্ধতি আবিষ্কার করার চাইতে আমাদের বেশি গুরুত্ব রয়েছে প্রযুক্তির উপর। এবং with this help of technology, we expect that we can change the whole planet. আমাদের মতো করে আমরা যেন প্ল্যানেটটাকে ঘুরিয়ে পেঁচিয়ে আমাদের মতো করে করে নিচ্ছি। And secondly, in case of production, we have two worlds, organic world and inorganic world. এই কিছুক্ষণ আগেই আমি দেখছিলাম একটি গাড়ি যাচ্ছিল কিছু প্রোডাক্ট বিক্রি করবে বলে, এবং সেখানে লিখছে আমরা যা বিক্রি করছি এগুলো সব প্রাকৃতিকভাবে উৎপাদিত। আগে তো প্রাকৃতিকভাবে উৎপাদনটি তো স্বাভাবিক, but nowadays we have to specially mention that this is organic and this is not organic. This change is due to technological advancement, no doubt. So we are living in a world of technology. With this, there is standardization of life. In the whole world, life is becoming standardized. সবাই যেন এক ধরনের একটা জীবনযাত্রার মধ্যে, একটা খাঁচার মধ্যে আছি, সবাই যেন এক সাধনা করছি একটা এক ধরনের জীবনযাত্রায় অভ্যস্ত হতে। With this standardization of life, the commodity pattern, the pattern of consumption, the pattern of enjoyment, সবকিছুই যেন একটা স্ট্যান্ডার্ডাইজড স্ট্রাকচারের সন্ধান করছি। And the third feature is collectivization of capital throughout the whole world. Whole world এর capital একত্রিত হচ্ছে। On the other hand, redistribution of denationalized labor. ক্যাপিটালের উল্টো দিকে যে শ্রম থাকে, আমরা যারা শ্রম দিই বিভিন্ন ক্ষেত্রে, ইন ডেস্ক অর ইন দ্য ফিল্ড, তার জন্য একটা রিডিস্ট্রিবিউশন হচ্ছে, এবং এটাকে আমি পার্টিকুলারলি বলেছি ডিন্যাশনালাইজড। কেন বলেছি এর পরেই এটা পরিষ্কার হবে। কিন্তু এই যে ইন দ্য এজ অফ গ্লোবালাইজেশন, from Calcutta to London, always we are on move. এখান থেকে সেখানে, সেখান থেকে সেখানে, there is cross border movements. আমাদের শ্রমের একটা ক্রস বর্ডার মুভমেন্টস হচ্ছে। সেটা ফিল্ড লেবারের হতে পারে, ডেস্ক লেবারের হতে পারে। তার ফলে ন্যাশনালাইজেশনের কনসেপ্ট, ন্যাশনালিজমের কনসেপ্ট আমরা পাল্টে ফেলছি। উই আর নাও ডিন্যাশনালাইজড। This is a very important feature as we think. Now, this has been achieved through globalization, of course. Globalization is the main source. A political economic mechanism. It is political economic mechanism vigorously advancing after awakening of Cold War bipolarity of the world. Cold War bipolarity দুর্বল হচ্ছে, গ্লোবালাইজেশন স্ট্রং হচ্ছে। এবং এই যে গ্লোবালাইজেশন যাকে আমরা বিশ্বায়ন বলি, এটা একেবারে যে নতুন তাও নয়, কিন্তু pre-war situation এটা ছিল একটা কালচারাল, সোশিও কালচারাল কনসেপ্ট, একটা সোশিও কালচারাল ভিশন অফ ইউনিভার্সালিজম। In the pre-war world, there was a socio cultural vision of universalism, but now that has been transformed into a technical view of a single unit of the world being interconnected with activities unhampered by local boundaries. যেটা ছিল একটা socio-cultural একটা concept, now it has been transformed into a technical concept, technical view of a single unit of the world interconnected with activities unhampered by local boundaries. No doubt it has had a profound political and cultural impact, especially in its current form of an uncontrolled global free market. এটা একটা টেকনিক্যাল কনসেপ্ট। আমরা সোশিও কালচারাল কনসেপ্ট অফ ইউনিভার্সালিজমকে ভুলেছি। একটা সময় আমরা ন্যাশনালিজমের কনসেপ্টের মধ্যে ছিলাম এবং সেই ন্যাশনালিজমটাকে মেলাতাম উইথ দ্য সোশিও কালচারাল কনসেপ্ট অফ ইউনিভার্সালিজম। এখন সেই ন্যাশনালিস্ট কনসেপ্ট, যেটা আমাদের যে কনসেপ্টটাও ছিল সোশিও কালচারাল, সেটাকে আমরা ভুলেছি। ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমিটাকেও একটা টেকনিক্যাল অ্যাসপেক্ট থেকে দেখছি এবং সেটাকে আমরা মেলাচ্ছি আরেকটা জগতের সঙ্গে, যেটাকে আমরা যেটা সম্পর্কেও আমাদের দৃষ্টিভঙ্গিটা খুবই টেকনিক্যাল। সেই জন্য আমি এই কথাটা ব্যবহার করলাম we have transformed the pre-war socio-cultural vision of universalism into a technical view of a single unit of the world, interconnected with activities unhampered by local boundaries. And no doubt it has a profound impact, political and cultural impact. A global free market এর একটা দারুণ impact আছে. Now, local identities are deconstructed. Deconstruction of local identities. Uniformity in life and work. From birth to death, from disease to its cure. এই যে আমরা এখন একটা প্যান্ডেমিক সিচুয়েশনের মধ্যে আছি, এই যে আমরা ডিজিজটাকে যে চোখে দেখছি, ডিজিজটাকে যেভাবে ফাইট করবার চেষ্টা করছি, সবটাই একটা সিঙ্গেল ভিউ। লন্ডন যে ভিউ দিয়ে দেখছে, নিউ ইয়র্ক যে ভিউ দিয়ে দেখছে, আমরা কলকাতায় বসে সেই ভিউ দিয়ে দেখছি, বহরমপুরের মানুষ সেই একই ভিউ দিয়ে দেখছে। ভিউ পয়েন্ট ইজ সেম। আমরা কিন্তু আগে তা করিনি। আগে যখন আমাদের গ্রামে গ্রামে যখন আমাদের মহামারী ছড়াতো, তখন যেভাবে সেটা আমরা ট্যাকল করতাম, the way we tackled the epidemic in our rural villages, ঠিক সেইভাবে আমেরিকা ট্যাকলড হতো না, ঠিক সেইভাবে লন্ডনে ট্যাকলড হতো না। বাট নাও there is a world view. ডিজিজেরও একটা ওয়ার্ল্ড ভিউ। We are fighting this pandemic period in a single way. So from birth to death, from disease to its cure, we have some uniformity. We have uniformity in life, we have uniformity in work. There is an appropriation of community cultures, all by creating an unassociated, self-distanced digital society. And these are the major trends of this globalization. The views of it are however polarized. এটাকে বিশ্বায়নটাকে, এই বিষয়টাকে কে কিভাবে দেখছে, সেই ভিউজ গুলোর মধ্যে ডিফারেন্স থাকতেই পারে। The views about it are polarized to some extent. The impact of globalization is negatively judged by those who benefit from it the least. যারা গ্লোবালাইজেশন থেকে বেশি বেনিফিটেড হচ্ছে না, তারা এটাকে নেগেটিভলি দেখবেই। But those who are potentially benefited, the entrepreneurs who can sell their goods, their capital profit more profitably in distant markets, who can outsource their costs to countries of cheap labor, the high-level, high-tech professionals, the employees educated in information technology and management, and the consumers with real or artificial purchasing power have welcomed it. So globalizationের ইম্প্যাক্ট আছে, কিন্তু সেই গ্লোবালাইজেশনটাকে কিভাবে রিসিভ করা হয়েছে, কিভাবে ভাবা হয়েছে, that those views are polarized. যারা এর সবচেয়ে কম বেনিফিট পেয়েছে তারা এটাকে ভালো চোখে দেখে না, কিন্তু there are many people, the entrepreneurs, the professionals, the high-tech educated people, and even the consumers with real or artificial purchasing power. Purchasing power এখন artificial purchasing power হচ্ছে because of the huge capital inflow through globalization process. So there is polarization in the judgment of globalization. But the net result is there is an increasing trend of social stratification. Class formation and class conflicts are now redefined. Under the global impact of globalization, class construction, class conflicts, everything is now redefined. Apart from changes in a simple but enlightened life in this post-truth age, এটাকে আমরা বলি post-truth age. Globalization একটা post-truth age তৈরি করেছে। Because why it is post-truth age? Reality is created out of many unreals by the globalized media partners. আমাদের সিম্পল অ্যান্ড এনলাইটেন্ড লাইফে চেঞ্জ তো এসেওছে, বাট অ্যাপার্ট ফ্রম চেঞ্জেস ইন দ্য সিম্পল এনলাইটেন্ড লাইফ, in this post-truth age, when reality is created out of unreals by globalized media partners, in this age, the transformation is visible in the most two important sectors of public life. এই সময়তে যখন আনরিয়ালস থেকে রিয়ালিটি তৈরি হচ্ছে, লাইফের ধরন পাল্টে যাচ্ছে, সেই সময়তে আমরা ইকোনমিক এবং অন্যান্য কনসিকুয়েন্স বাদ দিলেও উই ফাইন্ড সাম সিগনিফিক্যান্ট ট্রান্সফরমেশন ইন টু ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট সেক্টরস অফ পাবলিক লাইফ। I may identify these two sectors as nationality and democracy. Economic consequences, cultural consequences, apart from all those, তাছাড়াও এই যে গ্লোবালাইজেশন প্রসেসের মধ্যে আছি, এই যে আমরা পোস্ট ট্রুথ এজের মধ্যে আছি, যেখানে রিয়ালিটি ইজ ক্রিয়েটেড আউট অফ আনরিয়ালস, অনেক অবাস্তব মিথ্যে জিনিস থেকে রিয়ালিটি তৈরি হচ্ছে। কে তৈরি করছে? গ্লোবালাইজড মিডিয়া পার্টনার্স তৈরি করে দিচ্ছে। আর তার মধ্যেই বাস করতে করতে আমরা দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে অ্যাপার্ট ফ্রম কালচারাল কনসিকুয়েন্সেস, কালচারাল ইম্প্যাক্ট, অ্যাপার্ট ফ্রম ইকোনমিক ইম্প্যাক্ট, দুটো significant impact we are looking into it, we are finding out it. In two significant sectors there is great impact. One is idea of nationality and another is idea of democracy. If we explain these, India can easily be situated in this general frame. We can easily judge the past, present and future of India if we just conceptualize these transformation very well. We know that nation is a socio-cultural and historical inheritance, where a state is a political system possessing monopoly on the legitimate use of power. It is the general জিনিস। Nation একটা cultural concept, socio-cultural concept, a historical inheritance, একটা ঐতিহ্য থেকে তৈরি হয় nation. But state, modern state, it is a political system possessing monopoly on the legitimate use of power. ক্ষমতা ধারণ এবং ক্ষমতা ব্যবহারের একটা যন্ত্র। What does globalization do? Globalization de-recognizes the heredity. Whenever we touch upon the concept of nationality, we see that globalization de-recognizes the heredity of a territorial bound people. And hence, the concept of nation becomes backward and alien to generations being brought up in the global village. এই গ্লোবালাইজেশন পিরিয়ডে যারা বড় হচ্ছে, তাদের কাছে আমরা যারা গ্লোবালাইজেশনের আগে বড় হয়েছি, আমাদের কাছে ন্যাশনালিজমটা যেভাবে আসতো, এই গ্লোবালাইজেশনের যুগে যারা বড় হচ্ছে, তাদের কাছে ন্যাশনালিজম, কনসেপ্ট অফ ন্যাশনালিটি সেইভাবে আসে না, আসতে পারে না। কারণ গ্লোবালাইজেশন ইটসেলফ হ্যাজ de-recognized the cultural inheritance. In many countries, after globalization, we find in many countries of the European Union, passport and visa bar is lifted for cross-border movement of the citizens from one state to other, which could not be imagined in the traditional nation states, even up to the 1960s or mid-1970s. একটা কালচারাল কনসেপ্ট নেশনকে মিলিয়ে দেওয়া হয়েছিল পলিটিক্যাল কনসেপ্ট স্টেটের সঙ্গে, এবং সেটা ইভেন চলেছে আপ টু দ্য 1960s and mid-1970s. পাসপোর্ট ভিসা তার একটা ইন্ডিকেশন। In many European Union countries now, passport visa bar is being lifted. ওই কনসেপ্ট অফ নেশন স্টেট পাল্টে যাচ্ছে। And this development is not surprising at all. Migration, immigration, and emigration of both the entrepreneurs and the potential workforce is a natural consequence of what may be called the diasporic globalization. A nationality concept ভাঙবেই। গ্লোবালাইজেশন তো অনেকগুলো বাউন্ডারি সরিয়ে দিয়েছে। এখন apart from the refugee question, migration, immigration and emigration, the natural concept is now huge movement হচ্ছে মানুষের, যেটাকে আমরা বলবার চেষ্টা করছি এটা একটা ডায়াসপোরিক গ্লোবালাইজেশন। হিউজ মুভমেন্ট হচ্ছে এক জায়গা থেকে আরেক জায়গায় জায়গায়। ন্যাশনালিটির কনসেপ্ট আর থাকছে না সেই কারণে। As Eric Hobsbawm has shown, for the globalization of international mass migration, and migration, basically always migration is found as a movement from the poorer countries to the richer countries. So the in this globalization of international mass migration, we find that US, Canada, Australia, they received huge population. They received almost 22 million immigrants from all parts of the globe between 1974 and 1998. 22 million people সেখানে মাইগ্রেট করেছে 1974 থেকে 1998 সাল পর্যন্ত। From 1998 to 2001, these three countries had an inflow of 3.6 million. From 1999 to 2001, 4.5 million entered the 15 states of European Union. The foreigners legally living in Spain tripled between 1996 to 2003, from 500,000 to 1.6 million, more than tripled. The International Organization for Migration, IOM, has estimated that by the end of the 20th century, the number of migrants increased to more than 100 million, including 20 million refugees. The UN calculated that by the first decade of the 21st century, the number reached to 200 million. The result is increasing cosmopolitization of the globalized cities and loss of the idea of nationalism in terms of heredity. এই মুভমেন্ট কখনোই পুরনো ধরনের ন্যাশনালিজমের কনসেপ্টকে বাঁচিয়ে রাখতে পারে না। So with this diasporic globalization, a new and unique style of relations, cropped up between the homeland and hostland of the migrants. এই যে diasporic globalizationের ফলে এই যে ডায়াসপোরা, পিপলস মুভমেন্ট, পিপলের সামনে এখন দুটো ল্যান্ড, একটা হোমল্যান্ড, একটা হোস্টল্যান্ড, and a new type of relations between the homeland and hostland of the migrants is cropped up. That relation was and is first marked by long distance nationalism and then by transnationalism, facilitating money or capital remittance by electronic mode. প্রথমত হচ্ছে যে যেটা আমি বলতে চাইছি যে এই যে হিউজ ডায়াসপোরা হলো গ্লোবালাইজেশনের ফলে, এত মানুষ এদিক থেকে সেদিক, সেদিক থেকে এদিক, ইন্ডিয়া থেকে কত হিউজ নাম্বার অফ পিপল মাইগ্রেটেড টু ইউএসএ, ইউকে, অস্ট্রেলিয়া, কানাডা। এই যে মাইগ্রেশন, এই মাইগ্রেশনের ফলে আগের ন্যাশনালিজমের ভিত্তি যেটা ছিল জাস্ট কনসেপ্ট অফ হোমল্যান্ড, হোমল্যান্ডকে কেন্দ্র করে যে একটা ফিলিং অফ ন্যাশনালিজম গড়ে উঠত, এখন তার দুটো ল্যান্ড। এই যে যারা পিপল গ্লোবালাইজেশনের ফলে যে ওয়ার্কফোর্স হিসেবে যারা ছুটছে, তাদের সামনে এখন দুটো ল্যান্ড, একটা হোমল্যান্ড, একটা হোস্টল্যান্ড। যে ল্যান্ডে তারা ছিল, জন্মেছে, বড় হয়েছে, আর যেখানে তারা গেল, যেখানে তারা বাস করতে শুরু করলো সেই হোস্টল্যান্ড আর এই দুটো হোম the unique relations are being cropped up between these two lands, hostland and homelands. তার ফলে একটা লং ডিস্টেন্স ন্যাশনালিজম যেমন থাকে, Indians residing in America, they are now the American citizen or having permanent residence right in America. So their political obedience is to the American system, state system, but at the same time, তাদের হোমল্যান্ডকেও ভোলেনি. They have also some feelings towards the homeland. So sometimes the long distance nationalism and sometimes transnationalism তৈরি হচ্ছে। এই ট্রান্সন্যাশনালিজম বা লং ডিস্টেন্স ন্যাশনালিজম আর যে ন্যাশনালিজমের কথা আমরা আগে জানতাম এক নয়। So new concept of nationality, new concept of nationalism. আর এই হিউজ নাম্বার অফ পিপল যারা এক দেশ থেকে আরেক দেশে যাচ্ছে in various way, through electronic mode, তারা মানি রেমিট করছে, টাকা রেমিট করছে, এবং কিউমুলেটিভ ইফেক্ট of that money remittance is not very negligible. Between 2001 and 2006, such regular remittances almost doubled, and in many cases of the third world, particularly India, they have significant contribution to the maintenance of national economies. এবং তার ফলে ডুয়াল ন্যাশনালিটির কনসেপ্ট তৈরি হচ্ছে, কারণ তাদের রেমিটেন্স ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমি তৈরির ক্ষেত্রে একটা বড় ভূমিকা পালন করছে। They have a great role. The regular remittance have a very, very significant contribution for the growth of national economy of the lands where from they migrated. তারা এক জায়গায় সেখানকার ইকোনমিতেও পার্টিসিপেট করছে, আবার তাদের কালেকটিভলি তাদের কাছ থেকে যে রেমিটেন্স হচ্ছে তার ফলে যে দেশ হয়ে গেছে সেখানকার ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমিতেও একটা কন্ট্রিবিউশন থাকছে। ন্যাচারালি আলটিমেটলি দিস স্টেট তাদের থেকে the people migrated from this state to others, but even then they have not, they are still remembering their homeland, and this homeland also trying to make contacts with them because they have a significant contribution in the growth of national economy here. After globalization we have, এবং সেই কারণেই ডুয়াল ন্যাশনালিটির একই মানুষ having dual nationality. Suppose an India is settling in America. India is recognizing him, but he is a citizen of America. But India is also recognizing him. And he is enjoying a type of dual nationality. India has not actually agreed to dual nationality, but India has granted overseas citizenship in an indirect way. But there are more than 90 states who have granted dual citizenship, dual nationality. India has granted overseas citizenship. India has introduced Prabashi Bharatiyo Divas, Prabashi Bharatiyo Samman, and India has introduced overseas citizenship. In an indirect way, that is also recognizing the dual nationality. So nationality is not now a single nationality, it's a dual nationality. So the point which I had emphasized earlier, that this globalization has changed the type of nationalism or nationality. Benedict Anderson, as Benedict Anderson has observed, that the 21st century identity is not certified by the nation state's birth certificate. but by the document of international identity or plural nationality. Benedict Anderson একে বলছেন প্লুরাল ন্যাশনালিটি। যে নেশন স্টেটে জন্মেছে, যে নেশন স্টেট তাকে বার্থ সার্টিফিকেট দিয়েছে, দ্যাট ইজ নট অল ফর হিজ আইডেন্টিটি অর হার আইডেন্টিটি। Rather, her identity is documented by any international proof which actually justifies his plural or his or her plural nationality. Side by side with this, there is a change in the concept of economic nationalism also. There was a time when by economic nationalism we meant a feeling for the nation that would give the state a protective economy that would encourage the growth of the economy of this nation state, and that was the emotion which was termed as the economic nationalism. That concept has now changed. To follow what De Costa argues, Anthony De Costa, he has published a book from Oxford University Press, Economic Nationalism in Asia, Globalization and Economic Nationalism in Asia. To follow him, we find that the ongoing contested process, he says this, that ongoing contested process, in the ongoing contested process of international economic integration, flow of trade, investment, and technology, and interconnectivity of national economies are quite natural, making globalization both the expansion and outcome of national capitalism. এই যে international economic integration ঘটছে, national economy has become a part of the international economy. So এইবার ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমি কতটা আউটসাইড দ্য স্টেট এক্সপ্যান্ড করছে, সেটা অনেকটাই ইকোনমিক ন্যাশনালিজমের মাপকাঠি হয়ে দাঁড়াচ্ছে। If we look into what India tried to achieve by its economic reforms of the 1990s, we see, we would get an example in this policy of export sustaining industrialization, replacing import substituting industrialization. Import substituting industrialization, যেটাকে সংক্ষেপে বলে ISI, that was the policy of previous economic nationalism. Now it has changed, it has been changed to export sustaining industrialization. And there is increasing exports and booming outward FDI, foreign direct investment. Chinese economic nationalism is another glaring example for this. So the globalization has changed the concept of nationality side by side with the change of the idea of the national economy. Economic nationalism, the concept of economic nationalism has also changed. And the total impact এসে পড়ছে ডেমোক্রেটিক স্ট্রাকচারের উপরে। When this impact is felt side by side with this, we see that national democracies are now shaken under this impact. In this age of new world order, we find that national governments are determined more by the neo-economic nationalist capital holders than by the outward show of electoral mandates. This election process, electoral mandate, everything is now, to some extent, it is now, to the large extent, to the largest extent, it is now determined by actually the market. economic side. With the intrusion of trade money into democratic politics and emergence of crypto politics, democracy is now more or less, to borrow the term from Martin Moore's essay, democracy is now hacked. To add, it is now new, some disturbances that, okay, to add, it is now neurotically rationalized. But electoral mandate is not reflected. Democracy, যেভাবে আগে গভর্নমেন্ট গুলো ফর্মড হতো, যেভাবে আগে গভর্নমেন্ট গুলোর পলিসি ডিটারমিন্ড হতো, ইলেকটোরাল ম্যান্ডেটের দিকে তাকিয়ে, ইলেক্টরদের ইন্টারেস্টের দিকে তাকিয়ে, এখন এই নতুন ন্যাশনালিস্টিক যুগে, নতুন ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমির যুগে, ইন দ্য এজ অফ ইন্টিগ্রেশন অফ ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমি ইন দ্য ওয়ার্ল্ড ইকোনমি, এই যুগে সেই ইলেকটোরাল ম্যান্ডেট আর ডেমোক্রেসিকে রক্ষা করার ক্ষেত্রে তত কাজ করে না। Hobson rightly says that under these circumstances, the most convenient solution for national democratic governments is to keep as much decision, এটা Hobson থেকে আমি কোট করছি, to keep as much decision making as possible outside the range of public politics. Public politics এর বাইরে এখন decision making হয়। Even in Britain, the House of Commons is demoted in terms of decision making power, and there has been a massive transfer of functions to unelected institutions. Democratically elected নয়, এইরকম ইনস্টিটিউশনের হাতেই এখন বেশি ডিসিশন মেকিং পাওয়ার চলে যায়। Naturally, what is hampered is democracy. That means electoral mandate is not a determining factor now. So concept of nationality has changed. Concept of national economy has changed. Concept of economic nationalism has changed. And side by side, concept of democracy has also changed. National governments, outwardly elected democratically, but actually the national government is not determined, their policies are not determined by electoral mandates. They have some other mandates. সেই কারণেই এক বছর ধরে কিষাণ মুভমেন্ট চলতে পারে, but national government remains unresponsive. কৃষকরা এক বছর ধরে আন্দোলন চালিয়ে গেলেও আমরা দেখতে পাই যে ন্যাশনাল গভর্নমেন্ট আনরেসপন্সিভ থাকে, কারণ ন্যাশনাল গভর্নমেন্ট ইজ নট ডিটারমিন্ড বাই ইলেকটোরাল ম্যান্ডেট। আনইলেক্টেড ইনস্টিটিউশন গুলোই বেশি রোল প্লে করে বিকজ অফ দিস ক্যাপিটাল বেস। এখন আর সেইভাবে সেই পিপলস ইন্টারেস্ট দিয়ে, তাদের ইনহেরিটেন্স দিয়ে ন্যাশনালিটি জাজড হয় না। পিপলস রিডিস্ট্রিবিউশন অফ ওয়েলথ অ্যামাং দ্য পিপল, সেটা দিয়ে ইকোনমিক ন্যাশনাল ইকোনমির গ্রোথ বিচার করা হয় না। ইকোনমিক ন্যাশনালিজমও সেদিক থেকে আসে না, এবং ডেমোক্রেটিক ফর্ম অফ গভর্নমেন্টও এখন পাল্টে গেছে। ইলেকট্রাল ম্যান্ডেট, ডেমোক্রেসি is based on electoral mandate, কিন্তু electoral mandate doesn't determine the policies of the national governments. সেই জন্যই এক বছর ধরে কিষাণ মুভমেন্ট চললেও গভর্নমেন্ট আনরেসপন্সিভ থাকতে পারে। বছরের পর বছর ব্যারেজ থেকে জল ছেড়ে বছরের পর বছর বন্যা হয়ে গেলেও গভর্নমেন্ট ক্যান রিমেইন আনরেসপন্সিভ। শুধুমাত্র সহমর্মিতা প্রকাশটাই রেসপন্স নয়, measure নেওয়াটা রেসপন্স, but that is not possible. Without responding to the problems in permanent terms, in sustainable terms, the government can stay on. The net effect is people's loyalty to democratic state also decreases. The depressed youth, particularly in the quasi-modern states, alienated from the benefits of capitalist expansion, strengthens terrorist adventures. On the other hand, trans-border terrorism becomes a part of global business in the hands of such elite terrorists as Laden was. Democracy এই অবস্থা হলে people's loyalty to state কমবেই। People's loyalty to state কমলে anti-state activities বাড়বে, and that may take the shape of terrorism, which further shakes the democratic structure. In the quasi-modern state, that terrorism has a particular shape. In the modern states, that terrorism has an advanced appearance with high technology. And this terrorism is also globalized. It is also a part of business of terrorism in the hands of such elite terrorists as Laden was, Osama bin Laden was. It would be now very difficult for the states to control the in and out of its territory. এটাকে ঠেকানো এই এখনকার স্টেটগুলোর পক্ষে অসম্ভব প্রায়, due to vast increases in human mobility and large-scale removal of frontier management. Terrorism is globalized. Thus, both processes are on the rise. Globalization of terrorism and globalization of war against terrorism. On the one hand, there is globalization of terrorism. On the other hand, the globalization of war against terrorism. And obviously, দুটোই যদি রাইজ করতে থাকে, অর্থাৎ গ্লোবালাইজেশন অফ টেরোরিজম এন্ড গ্লোবালাইজেশন অফ দ্য ওয়ার এগেইনস্ট টেরোরিজম দুটোই যদি রাইজ করতে থাকে, তাহলে ডেমোক্রেটিক স্ট্রাকচার আরো ফল করতে থাকবে, যেটা আজ আমরা চারপাশেই দেখতে পাচ্ছি যে ডেমোক্রেটিক স্ট্রাকচার ইজ গ্র্যাজুয়ালি বিং ওয়েকেন্ড and peoples are losing loyalty to the democratic structures. So ultimately what happens? To us, globalization is now a double-edged sword. একটা তরবারি যার দুদিকে ধার, redefining nations, redefining democracy, statism, anti-statism. These are there and were and are now simply the tools for formation of technopoly. We are now advancing towards a technopoly where, as the Mexican poet and Nobel laureate Octavian Paz had professed, Octavian Paz বহু আগে এটা বলেছিলেন, সেই টেকনোপলির দিকে আমরা যাচ্ছি, যেখানে the life of man would be depopulated and there will be more things than beings, B-E-I-N-G-S. টেকনোলজি আমাদের টুল থাকবে না, আমরা টেকনোলজি টুল হয়ে যাব। কমোডিটি আমাদের কনজিউম করবে, আমরা ডেমোক্রেসির প্রতি আস্থা হারাবো, আমরা ন্যাশনালিটির কনসেপ্ট চেঞ্জ করে দেব, আমরা ডিন্যাশনালাইজড হব, আমরা ডিকনস্ট্রাক্টেড হব, and we will arrive at a technopoly যেখানে life of man would be depopulated and there will be only things, more things than the beings. So this is the present scenario যেখানে ন্যাশনালিটি, ডেমোক্রেসি, টেরোরিজম সবকিছুই অন দ্য চেঞ্জ। আমরা জানি না যে how we would face in later ages. If we situate India in this broad framework, we can easily understand that whatever I have pointed out in this session, India is facing all the same problems. This is India's present and future are being determined by these developments. This is the broad theme which I wanted to present here. So thank you all who have given a patient hearing to what I say. Thank you all again. And with this, I conclude my keynote address here in this session. Thank you. Thank you again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your excellent presentation. And I hope that those who some of my friends were asking me that such a theme that may raise many questions or many debate or like this. I think they are very much clear after listening Professor Alok Ghosh. And on behalf of the Department of History, I again express my gratitude to you, sir, that you are always there for us. Whenever we approach to you, you always extended your helping hand. Thank you once again. Now I can see that our next speaker, Dr. Syed Ali Nadim Razavi, Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University, has joined us. Sir, on behalf of the Department of History, Sripat Singh College, I welcome you, and I am very grateful to you that you have given your consent for delivering a lecture. And I must say that Professor Rizvi is my teacher at the university, and I am very proud to be his student. And I again thank you, sir. Before I invite Professor Ali Nadim Razavi, I would introduce him very briefly. Dr. Syed Ali Nadim Razavi is a professor and former chairman and coordinator, Department of History, Aligarh Muslim University. He has experienced 32 years of teaching and obtained his PhD degree on the title Urban Middle Classes in Mughal India. His areas of interest are medieval Indian history, especially art and architecture of medieval India and medieval archaeology, etc. He holds many academic posts in the university, wrote a number of book chapters and excellent academic papers, various academic journals, and a number of scholars have been awarded PhD and MPhil degree under his supervision. His book, Fatehpur Sikri, Revisited from Oxford University Press, is an excellent addition to the architectural history of medieval India. With this brief introduction, I invite Professor Ali Nadim Razavi to deliver his lecture, and he will be focusing on the concept of India as given by Amir Khusro. Sir, please.
Thank you, Emily. Respected guests, dear friends, both scholars and participants to this program. First of all, let me thank all of you, the management and officials of Sripat Singh College and the Department of History, University of Kalyani, for inviting me to give this talk today. More specifically, I would like to thank the principal of the college, Mr. Dr. Shamsuzama, and of course my student from Aligarh, Srimati Emily Rumi, who is also the organizing secretary, who actually approached me and persuaded me to be here amongst you. Thank you very much. Today, I will try to discuss with you a topic which is extremely important. India and its nationhood. You just have been hearing Dr. Ghosh. I will take you back in time. I'll be taking you back in remote past to see what type of notions did we have as a nation. For us, it is very crucial to comprehend as to since when were we a nation? From Vedic times to the present, continuously? Or did these ideas emerge gradually over a period of time? We know that terms like nation, nationalism are actually of very modern origins. But did we ever in our past have such type of notion? Or is this something which is a result of our colonial past? Today, I will place before you the crucial role which a person of Turkish origins and who adopted this land as his home, Amir Khusro, had to play in the emergence of this idea of India as a distinct nation. Remember, he was a poet, a mystic, and a noble of 13th century who was born in India to Turkish parents and is buried at Delhi. Let us go first into some background. We know that geographical knowledge is a prerequisite before the concept of a nation can arise. We need not be surprised then that as far as India is concerned, such a concept is not present in the Vedas. The first firm evidence of the idea of India is perhaps not older than Gautam Buddha's time, some 2,500 years ago. That is around circa 500 BC. When we first hear of the 16 Mahajanpadas, which together comprise northern India and parts of Afghanistan. But it is with the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka the Great and his inscriptions found all over India datable to around 250 BC that we find one of India's early names, Jambudweep. In the Pali it is written as Jambudweep. Used in his rock edict number 1, and this term was being used for a country as a whole. The cultural affinities of the Indian people, isolated from others by high mountain regions in the north and by the Indian Ocean in the south, could only be marked more certainly when there was knowledge of other people outside of these borders. People, that is, who could be seen as culturally different. Ashoka says in his rock edict 18 that the Yonas, that is Greeks, were different because they had no Shamanas, that is Buddhist priests, and Brahmanas amongst them. Thus, a cultural distinction could reinforce a territorial one. A similar distinction occurs in the reference made in the Manusmriti, which was compiled around circa 100 BC, where reference is made to foreigners, Malechas, their lands, where Brahmanas do not perform sacrifices, or the twice born. And all these references, come from around circa 100 BC. The listing of India's regions in the Mahabharata or Samudragupta's Allahabad inscription or Kalidas Meghadoot underlined again a fairly distinct concept of India as a geographical and cultural world of its own. The concept could indeed lead to rigid insularity. In 11th century, we have Al-Biruni, who came to India along with the Sultan Mahmud of Ghazna. While studying Indian civilization in his Arabic work, Kitabul Hind, which was written around 1035 AD at Lahore, he commented adversely on the Indians' sense of isolation. They believed, he said, that there was no other country like theirs and had no desire to learn about or from other people. Al-Biruni's own book, whose writing the famous historian K.N. Panikkar described as a moment in history, is itself the evolution of the comprehension of India as a cultural entity. It is the first comprehensive study of the Indian civilization, including Sanskrit. This fact reminds us that the consciousness of one's belonging to a country can also be reinforced by outsiders' realization that its inhabitants have institutions and features different from theirs. The Iranians had long extended their version of the name of the Sindhu river, which they called Hind or Hindu, changing Sa into Ha in early Iranian. And this term they use for the country lying along and beyond that river known as Hind or Sindh. From hence came the name India, given by the Greeks, and also possibly the Chinese term Yin Tu. In post-Hellenistic Iran, territorial names began to be given the suffix Istan, so that Hindu or Hind would become Hindustan. And we can give analogy of that from other Iranian territorial names, for example, Shakistan, which is now today known as Sistan, Gurjistan, Khuzistan, and there are innumerable such names which are there in the Iranian world. Hindustan, just like the name Hind, is thus an entirely Iranian word. The style of writing Hindustan, as if it is a Sanskrit word meaning land of the Hindus, is a modern invention. The word in this form is unknown to classical Sanskrit. We must also remind ourselves that the word Hindu too is of a purely Iranian origin, meaning an inhabitant of Hind, that is India. It was taken from the Iranians by the Arabs and Muslims in general, among whom, up till the time of Al-Biruni, there was little reason to distinguish between those who were Indians and those who, besides being Indians, followed religious sects other than Islam. Once the Muslims established themselves in large parts of India, that is 13th century onwards, the latter restrictive meaning of the word began to predominate, and Hindu assumed a religious color. But by the Hindus themselves, the name was not accepted before the latter half of the 14th century. It is then around 14th century that the Vijayanagar ruler and later on the ruler of Mewar are found styling themselves as Hindu sultans. In fact, Vijayanagar ruler in various inscriptions gives this title, Hindu Suratrana, which is very much there if you go to Hampi. Simultaneously, the words Hindi and Hindustani came into use for Indians in general, the designations being used by the poets Amir Khusro, who died in 1324, and Isami, who died in 1350, when they spoke of both Hindu and Muslim inhabitants of this country taken together. This discussion would be a digression into mere linguistic history, but for the fact that linguistic usage had some new concepts behind it. Along with the common names of Hindi and Hindustani, for both the Hindus and Muslims of India, came an understanding of a common heritage and a composite culture. If we are looking for patriotic statements about India and its natural and cultural greatness, then surely Amir Khusro's work known as Nuh Sipaher, which he compiled in 1318, and he wrote it in Persian, must be identified as the earliest and clearest of such statements. Amir Khusro, in this work, lauds love for one's country, Hubbe Watan. His country, that is Hind, India, he says, contains people speaking different languages, which he lists. And he writes, gives the names of these languages. For example, he includes Kannada, which he calls Thor Samudra, Telugu, which he calls Telangi. And he also mentions Mahabari, that is Tamil. Incidentally, Malayalam does not seem yet to have been fully separated from Tamil. So its omission is probably not very surprising in Amir Khusro's otherwise comprehensive list. All these languages, from north to south, he calls Hindui or Hindavi, that is Indian languages, which he says were being used by common people for all purposes. Besides them, the Hindui languages, he praises Sanskrit, the language of the learned, for its rich literature. He carefully records that Persian too has become a language of India because people have learned it since the coming of the Aryans and Turks. There is then a picture of the Indian people with their various languages yet constituting a single whole. What makes Khusro's verses especially patriotic is his avowed argument of the precedence of India over other countries. He speaks of the superiority of its products, its fruits, its animals, the beauty of its women, the learning and piety of the Brahmins, and of course, India's numerous cultural achievements such as the invention of numerals, the invention of chess, the compilation of Panchtantra, which ultimately became famous in the Arab world as Kalila or Damna. Clearly, such a comprehensive picture of India and of its culture, which is seen not as exclusive as Al-Biruni had judged it, but open to all, innovative and tolerant, reveals a new understanding that could only have come because conditions had changed. This change was surely the one due to the confluence of two great civilizations, ancient Indian and Islamic, that had now taken place. A momentous confluence which one of my senior teachers at Aligarh, Professor M. Athar Ali, in one of his articles described as medieval efflorescence. Amir Khusro whose work which I am dealing here today, was born at Patiali in the modern district of Etah in Uttar Pradesh. He was born in 1253 AD, 13th century, mid-13th century. His father, Amir Saifuddin Mahmud, was a Turk who had migrated to India during the reign of Iltutmish, some years prior to the birth of his son Khosrow. He had come from a city known as Kush, which now is known as Shahre-Sabz, which is situated in Uzbekistan. His mother was the daughter of Imadul Mulk, who was a noble stationed at Delhi. Now this work of Amir Khusro, No Sipaher, is divided into 9 chapters which correspond to 9 skies or spheres of the heavens. And it is in the 3rd chapter of this work that we find a long and detailed eulogy of India. Amir Khusro very proudly asserts in this, and I quote him, "If my adversary taunts me as to why I prefer Hind over other lands, I would say there are 2 reasons for this assertion. The first reason is that this land, since time immemorial, has been destined to be the place of my birth, abode, and it is my motherland, Vatan," unquote. He further justifies the praise and precedence which his motherland deserves by citing a well-known tradition of the Prophet of Islam. The love of motherland is an essential part of the true faith. Hubbul Watan Minal Iman. He asserts that this is an essential part of his deen, that is creed, of his faith. In the introductory section of this chapter, Khusro clarifies that the praise of India was reserved in this section as the presiding planet of both the 7th sky, to which this chapter corresponded, and India, Hind, was Saturn. He claims that although Rum, that is Greece, Khorasan, that is Iran, Khotan, China, all of them allege that they are superior. But he, that is Khusro, had knowledge of the efficacy of these countries' magic, and he could prove that Hind is better than any other country. And he goes on to write, and I quote Amir Khusro, "If the Creator bestows upon me the gift so that my easy flowing pen may be empowered to express qualities to perfection, I aspire not to leave the greatness of this land on earth concealed, but raise it to the sky up to the height of the heaven." He goes on to give the proof of India's greatness. He enumerates 7 rational, aqli proofs of the assertion that India was the earth's paradise. The first argument which he put up is that after being thrown out from heaven, Adam found refuge in India. According to Amir Khusro, and I quote him, "As Hind was just like Khuld Nishan, just like heaven, Adam could descend here and find repose." He then elaborates it further. He remarks that it is the land with the heavenly bird, the peacock. And I quote him once again, "Had Firdaus, paradise, been in some other country, this bird would have gone thither." And along with that, he says that the serpent, which was a companion of the peacock in heaven, also accompanied it to this land. But as this land was known for its good and beneficial deeds, while the serpent had the vice of biting, it was allotted a place below the earth and not above it. Khosrow puts forward 4 other arguments, which include the moderate climate of India as compared with the severe climatic conditions of his Central Asian homeland, and the tradition of the Prophet that the faithful would receive their reward not in this world, but in the heaven, while the unbelievers would enjoy here itself. And he writes, Hind was a paradise for the unbelievers since the advent of Adam till the coming of Islam. Even in recent times, these infidels have had every pleasure of heaven like wine and honey. After establishing that India was the heaven on earth, Khosrow goes on to discuss the reasons of his preference of Hind over Rum, Iraq, Khorasan, and other places, and discourses on the ideal climate of the country, its flowers and fruits. While writing on this, Khosrow says, the Khorasanians are deafened by the excessive cold and do not listen to the arguments of India being heaven. And instead of doing that, they accuse it of possessing an extremely hot climate. In reply to this, I say what the Prophet had once said. The hot weather is troublesome, and that is all. But everyone is killed through cold weather. Also says that the climate is so moderate that a poor peasant, Dehkan, spends the night in the pasture land grazing his flock, and with only a single cloak wrapped around him. A Brahman can take his bath in the cold water of the river early in the morning, while a mere branch of a tree is enough to shade the poor of the country. He lists the prized gifts of India. There is the spring season, Bahar, all the year round in India, and thus an abundance of greenery and beautiful fragrant flowers which do not lose their fragrance even after they wilt. He enlists the juicy fruits of India, mangoes, bananas, which are extremely soft and juicy, sugarcane, cardamom, camphor, cloves are all mentioned by him as the dry fruits of India. Betel leaf, pan, comes for a special mention. He says, leaf which is eaten like a fruit, and there is nothing elsewhere in the world like it. He tells us that betel leaf, presumably an expensive commodity at the time, was something meant for the elite. Dealing with the commonly spoken languages during his time, Hindavi and Persian, which I have already referred earlier, and the regional dialects, Khosrow further points out, and I quote him, surely the popularity of Turkish grew similarly. It spread with the Turkish rule on the earth, as it was the language of prominent people. The commoners also adopted it, and it became popular in the world. Hind similarly got its spoken languages. Hindavi is and has been the spoken language of India. The Horids and Turks came, and Persian was spoken by them. The people, when they came into contact with them, by and by acquired the knowledge of Persian. The other languages which were there were constrained to be confined in their own areas. After mentioning these languages, Khosrow also tells us about the linguistic versatility of the Indians. He says that whereas an Indian can fluently converse in any of the foreign languages, people outside India are unable to speak Indian dialects. The people of Khita, Mongol, Turks, Arabs, in speaking Indian dialects, get soon lips. They can't speak them. But we can speak any language of the world as expertly as a shepherd tends his sheep. Khosrow's patriotism was not just theoretical. He claims to have himself mastered the Indian languages. In fact, he tells us that he could not only speak it, but also write verses in the Hindavi dialects which were prevalent during that period of time. Amir Khusro mentions Sanskrit and its rich literature, but remarks that it was the language of the Brahmins. Even amongst them, not all can claim mastery over this language. Like Arabic, Sanskrit has its grammar, definitions, systems, techniques, rules, and literature. Khusro, with great pride, mentions that scholars from all over the world come to India to gain knowledge and expertise. However, a Brahmin never leaves the boundaries of India to acquire knowledge as there is no need for him to do so. Brahmins, in their knowledge and intellect, are far superior to the knowledge of all the books written by Aristotle. Whatever the Greek revealed in philosophical thought to the world, Amir Khusro says the Brahmins had a greater wealth. However, these Brahmins are by nature quiet and do not speak much, so that most of their knowledge remains hidden from the world and tends generally to be misunderstood. Khusro, however, counts himself among those who acknowledge their virtues and qualities. Dealing with the superior knowledge and learning of the Indians, he remarks, and I quote him, "I may be slightly biased in my views, yet whatever I'll submit, I shall justify through, though there are men of letters everywhere, nowhere is wisdom, that is Danish, and philosophy so well written as it is written in Hindustan. Logic, astrology, and scholastic theology are found and well understood in India. All rational sciences, the natural sciences and mathematics originated in India. Regarding the Indian origin of the numerals Hindisa, Khusro again goes on to describe how the Indian wisdom came up with hikmat, that is arithmetic, and discovered zero. Without the Indian arithmetic and Hindisa, Hindisa, he says, is a word which is derived from two separate words, Brahman and Asat. And together, they mean Hindisa. The creator of Hindisa, the writing was a Brahman. And however strange it may appear, the Greek science came to depend on it. That is what he says. Amir Khusro also mentions the invention of chess. He mentions Khalil-o-Damna, which had such an excellent flight of imagination. Another singular contribution of the Indians which Khusro mentions is Indian music and its hypnotizing effect even on the animals. Amir Khusro, in his description of India, which, as I said, starts from the Himalayas and goes down to the Indian Ocean, he mentions almost all type of birds and animals, the Indian beauty, the Indian clothes. They are all mentioned by Amir Khusro, and he very proudly says that these are all, things which are found only in my Vatan. I would have gone on and on. I mean, I would suggest that I have a paper on Amir Khusro's idea of India and how he has defined the whole of the subcontinent, picking up each and everything and from this country, as well as exhorting the love of the nation that was India, which, according to him, was a religious obligation for the people. And with this brief introduction, I can only say that this text of Amir Khusro becomes one of the first texts to be written in the Indian subcontinent, which deals with the entire country in its entirety and treats it as a nation. Although we should all remember that the very concept of the term nation is 19th century, but whatever concept of a unified country with a unified literature and culture could exist comes from Newspaper, which was composed by Amir Khusro during the 13th century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your excellent presentation, and it was very informative for us. We have 2 or 3 questions. Can I take, sir? Sir, we have 2 or 3 questions.
Yes, please go ahead.
I can place. Okay. From our students, one question is that the multiculturalism and pluralism that we see in Amir Khusro's work, so are they in recent days India, are these features of Indian society under threat? He wants to know your opinion.
Pardon, can you repeat a little louder?
Okay. One of our students wants to know that multiculturalism and pluralism that has been described by Amir Khusro, do you think that these features of Indian society are under threat in this present in present India?
India, since the very beginning, has been a multicultural country. Right from the Rig Vedic times down to the present century, multiculturalism has been the hallmark of the country. Number 1. Number 2, we know about the spirit of tolerance towards all type of people, which was tried to be developed during the period of Ashoka the Great. His, epigraphs, his edicts are there for us to, that how equal treatment to all the citizens, whether they were Brahmanas or Shamanas, was supposed to be given by the state. That is very much there. However, there was a feeling of insularity which dominated this entire subcontinent down to the coming of the Turks in India. In fact, during the 10th century, the insular nature of the Indian civilization is very clearly brought out by Kitabul Hind. And Amir Khusro becomes the first person who started penning down this multiculturalism and giving the name Hind, using the name Hind for the entire subcontinent. So I will not say that it is with Amir Khusro or during the 13th century that India as a subcontinent arose, not at all. It was there, but what I am trying to point out is that for the first time, a very conscious attempt to record this multiculturalism was made by Amir Khusro, a person whose family had just arrived from outside the borders. He was from Uzbekistan. But he starts taking pride in the fact that he was destined to be born in the subcontinent known as Hind. So that was the import. Let me also point out that this did not end with Amir Khusro. This multiculturalism, in fact, remained a hallmark down to the 18th century. It was during the 18th century, at a time when the Mughal Empire was at decline, that for the first time, our society, the so-called Indian society, experienced the first communal riots. It was only during the 18th century, 1700 something, 1750s, that we start hearing of communal conflagrations. Before that, the country survived as a multicultural society, and my appeal to all of you here is to once again try to rebuild that country as it had existed for centuries.
Thank you. Another question is, sir, what are Masnavis? What are Masnavis?
Masnavis are in fact versified, hagiographical accounts, which tell us about the valor of the person about which a Masnavi is being written. These are in fact, stories, not hagiographical stories. They are not historical truths. The poet has the liberty to interpret his subject, and in his Masnavi, he lauds the subject of the Masnavi, and in other words, it becomes a panegyric. So one can say that versified panegyric is a Masnavi.
Yes, sir. Another question is there any information of Indian caste system in Khosrow's work? Caste system.
Well, caste, you will be surprised to know, although most of the Muslims, some of you who are also part of this group, would always take pride that we Muslims had no caste. And it is, one of the banes of the Hindu society. The fact of the matter is that since Islam came into contact with Hinduism, none of the Islamic or Muslim writer or any of the ruler, in fact, explicitly condemned the caste. None of them did. In fact, they imbibed this whole system to such a degree that caste is very much a part of the Muslim society now. Having said that, I would say that one of the first books written by the newly conquering, Turks was the writing in Arabic, Kitabul Hind by Al-Biruni. Al-Biruni very explicitly, when he is describing the Indian society, he describes the caste system. He also discusses the rigidity which he found in the Indian society. Perhaps the type of rigidity which he was mentioning was only theoretical because he was consulting the Brahmins to understand the concept. But mark it that he never criticized it. Caste is possibly, perhaps, accepted by all. So much so that even when Babur comes to India, much later than Amir Khusro and others, during the 16th century, Babur too mentions caste, but never criticizes. Akbar, who is known for the social reforms, he speaks against sati. He speaks against child marriage. He speaks in favor of widow remarriage. He speaks against slavery. But at no place does he utter a single word against the caste system which was prevalent in India. Possibly, the caste system suited the ruling classes. And that is why, whether it was the Muslim ruling class or the Hindu ruling class, whether it was the Rajputs or the Mughals or the Sultans, none of them ever spoke a word against the caste system, although the caste is being mentioned again and again by the persons who are writing about the Indian society.
Thank you, sir. One more question. How relevant is Amir Khusro's patriotism in today's India?
That is why I chose this topic. Today, when we are being divided on the basis of our religion, on the basis of our caste, on the basis of our ideology, it is very important for us to remember people like Amir Khusro. Amir Khusro is important for us in the sense that in no way is he a bad Muslim. He is a faithful, he believes in Islam. A person who is given to religion. He is one of the chief disciples of Nizamuddin Aulia. But in spite of that, he keeps on citing the prophetic traditions that the love of the Watan is a part of our faith. He had no compunction. He could have easily praised, the Islamic countries, Central Asia. At one point he says that, when he praises India, he says that when Adam came from heaven on this earth, he ate the fruits of this country. But when he went towards Central Asia, it was there that he put out the refuse from his stomach. पहले उसने हिंदुस्तान में आके खाना खाया और जो पेट से जो अपने गंदगी निकाली, that was in the Islamic lands. This is how, in spite of it, he doesn't praise, Makkah, Medina, that they are the places. No, he finds that the best place on earth is the country where you are born. So this type of nationalism is something which has to be understood not only by the Muslims who live in India today, but this type of nationhood is also to be understood by those who are not the Muslims, but who try to differentiate between Hindus and Muslims. I see that there was a question by someone who asked, what is the concept of Hindisa? Hindisa is nothing but, writing alphabet and numeral. Hindisa simply means the numeral and alphabet. And according to Amir Khusro, the numeral system was found out by the Indians, and from India it traveled to outside countries. So he very much, in fact, mentions that even the concept of zero, on which the whole arithmetic basis is something which was given by his motherland to the other civilizations. That is the meaning of Hindisa which is used.
Thank you, sir. We have more questions, but because of shortage of time, he cannot take more. So once again, I express my sincere gratefulness to you, and I hope that we would listen you in near future. And from the entire team, I really express my regards to you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Goodbye. Good luck.
Thank you, sir. Dear participants, hope you are enriched and enlightened yourself by the valuable talk of Professor Alok Kumar Ghosh and Professor Syed Ali Nadim Rizvi. And I can see that our next speaker, Dr. Milindo Banerjee from the School of History, University of St. Andrews, has joined us. On behalf of the Department of History, Sripat Singh College, I welcome you, sir, to our international seminar. And once again, through mail, I express my gratefulness again and again. And I welcome you. So before I invite you to deliver the lecture, I would introduce Dr. Banerjee in brief. Dr. Milindo Banerjee is a lecturer in modern history at the School of History, St. Andrews University, UK. His area of specialization is history of modern political thought and political theory post 1700. Previously, he had researched and taught at Heidelberg University, Presidency University, and Ludwig Maximilian University. His publications include The Mortal God, Imagining the Sovereign in Colonial India, and it was published from the Cambridge University Press. He is an associate editor of the journal Political Theology and founder editor of Critical Readings in Global Intellectual History and Trans-Regional Practices of Power. And a number of book chapters and academic journals have been published to his name, and it is quite a long list. So I would rather like to listen from him, and he will be focusing on decolonize political thought, rethinking the roots of Indian democracy. Dear participants, if you have any query, any question, please place it in the chat box. We will take up after the lecture is over. Thank you, participants, for being there. Sir, I invite you on the web desk.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rumi, for this very kind invitation. Can you hear me? Can you see and hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah. Warmest thanks to the Department of History of Sripat Singh College, as well as to the Department of History, Kalyani University, for this very kind invitation. I can see that the topic of your international webinar is about globalization, democracy, and nationalism, past, present, and future of India. I think there is a bit of echo. Maybe if the audience members might want to switch off their microphones, that might prevent the echo. So my talk, as you heard from Dr. Rumi, is entitled Decolonizing Political Theory, Rethinking the Roots of Indian Democracy. Is there an echo here? Maybe there's kind of some...
Emily ma'am, microphone off korun, Emily ma'am. Okay, sir, continue.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will be speaking in English, but in case you have questions in either English or Bengali, I'm happy to answer in either English or Bengali. আমি ইংরেজিতে বলবো, কিন্তু কারোর যদি বাংলাতেও প্রশ্ন করতে ইচ্ছা হয় বা ইংরেজিতে প্রশ্ন করতে ইচ্ছা হয়, উভয় ভাষাতেই স্বচ্ছন্দ, আমি উভয় ভাষাতেই উত্তর দিতে পারি। আমার হিন্দিটা জটায়ুর মতোই ভালো, ফলে হিন্দিতে প্রশ্ন শুনলে বুঝতে পারবো, কিন্তু উত্তরটা কতটা ভালোভাবে দিতে পারবো বলতে পারছি না, বাংলা বা ইংরেজিতে হয়তো উত্তরটা দেবো। So the topic for basically what I want to do today is link two things which are part of global discussions at the moment. One is about what does decolonizing political theory mean? Because obviously a lot of the political thought and theory that we study, whether it's Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau or Hegel or whoever, come from European context. And the reason we study them is because of European colonial hegemony over the non-Western world, whether it be over India or the Islamic world or Africa or wherever else. Then what would decolonizing political theory mean? And essentially thinking beyond the kind of ways of thinking about state and capitalism, which have been central to classical European political theory. And the second strand of thinking, which I want to link with that, and I would argue it's inseparably linked, is how do we actually conceptualize democracy? Do we conceptualize democracy only in a Eurocentric way, or are there Indian, South Asian, non-Western ways of thinking about both the theory as well as the practice of democracy? And I hope to bring the two of them into conversation, also linking subaltern studies theory, with which many of you would be familiar with recent debates in global history. So the talk is divided basically into 4 parts. I will begin with a very short abstract of what is my main argument. Then I will go into what debates on decolonizing the curriculum are going on in Britain, Europe, and North America, and what does decolonizing political theory mean in the context of those debates about decolonizing the curriculum. Then I will go into kind of how can we think about an alternative, non-Western, non-Eurocentric history of Indian democracy, which is not pegged only to the spread of Western liberal ideas and so on. And then the longest part of my paper, I will basically be looking at Indian intellectual cultural resources from pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial periods in order to think about democracy, multi-species democracy. That's something I'm very interested in. Democracy beyond anthropocentrism, democracy beyond hyper-centralized structures of state sovereignty and capitalism, and how to think about that in non-Eurocentric ways. So to begin with my talk, and as I understood from Dr. Rumi, basically my talk would roughly be somewhere between 45 and 60 minutes, giving us ample time then for question and answers and discussions. So to begin with my basic argument very synoptically is this. 2 specters are haunting the world today, state and capital. Together they degrade human and non-human beings into subjects, commodities. They transform being into unbeing. Intellectual historians have until now largely described how these 2 specters came into existence and got globalized in their present form through European colonialism and anti-colonial elite nationalist resistance. They have traced out the conjuncted histories of state and capital by studying figures like Hobbes, Locke, Adam Smith, Kemal Ataturk, or Jawaharlal Nehru. But, and this is my main argument now, the task of decolonizing intellectual history, decolonizing political theory, should be to offer us pathways towards overcoming state and capital. So this is my main argument. Now let me get into the next section, which is about intellectual history. So I am by expertise, profession, an intellectual historian. What intellectual historians basically do is they study political and social thought, or other kinds of thought. And as opposed to, let's say, social historians who are invested in studying social transformations, economic historians who often study about production and exchange of commodities, movement of capital, and so on. Intellectual historians are primarily interested in the history of ideas, as well as in contextualizing those ideas. Now, when we are speaking about intellectual history, in the European academy, in Europe and North America, intellectual history for a long time largely meant white male elite intellectual history. So people, let's say in Cambridge or Oxford or Princeton or Harvard or whatever, would study canonical white male intellectuals, figures like, for example, Hobbes and Locke and Baudin and Machiavelli and Rousseau and so on. They would not be very interested in studying A, women intellectuals, B, they were not very interested in studying non-white, non-Western intellectuals. So they would not be interested in studying figures like, for example, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, or Shankaracharya, or Buddha, or Gandhi, or Tagore, or so on. Now, this has, of course, to do this kind of inward preoccupation, one might call navel gazing, of the European academy, of course, had to do with the fact, kind of with the hierarchies of academia, where European political and social thought was seen as central to the birth of modernity. And therefore, in order to understand state or capitalism or market or property relations, it was assumed that it was important to study Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, etc., but not to study Arab intellectuals or Chinese intellectuals or Iranian intellectuals. Now, of course, while the Western academy was invested in this kind of Eurocentric thinking, at the same time, of course, you have parallel developments in non-Western parts of the world. And this was often linked with anti-colonial politics. So if you look at India, figures like K.P. Jaiswal from the 1910s onwards, or other figures like Upendranath Ghoshal and many others, wanted to argue that Indians were not just concerned with metaphysics, with religion and spirituality, they were also kind of had the skills to produce original political thought. And that's why the rediscovery of Kautilya's Arthashastra in the 1900s is such an epochal moment, not just in Indian political thought, but in Indian politics as such. So basically, from the early 20th century onwards, a series of Indian historians, scholars more generally, began to create a canon of Indian political thought in order to establish parity and equivalence with European political thought, basically to argue that it's not just Europeans who are capable of sophisticated thinking, but Indians are also capable of this. And I would imagine that there would have been similar gestures in China, in Iran, in the Arab world, and other parts of the non-Western world. The problem with this kind of canon building was, of course, that it created an alternative canon, which was often as much elite and as male as the old white canon. But still, of course, it succeeded to some extent in destabilizing the notion that only Europeans are capable of thought. Now, the interesting moment that I want to describe now is across the last perhaps 1 or 2 decades, things have gradually begun to change, where this kind of regional area studies orientation of intellectual history has come under severe attack. And part of the reason for this is simply globalization. I mean, there is more movement of people, there is more movement of goods, there is more movement of ideas across the world. And a lot of people are therefore interested in studying, let's say, ideas about democracy or ideas about property or economy or human rights, not just in the context of the Western world or in the context of bounded regions such as India or China, but in studying how ideas interact across social cultural borders, across classes, across geographies, and how ideas get constructed and distributed and globalized in global ways. So ideas not just as confined to specific regions, Hobbes in 17th century England, Rousseau in 18th century France, but how ideas mesh with, interact, and globalize. And a very important moment in this sort of turn is, of course, codified by the 2013 publication of the book Global Intellectual History by the historians Andrew Sartori, who is a historian of colonial Bengal, and Samuel Moyn, who is a premier intellectual historian of Western ideas about human rights. And then gradually a journal has appeared, which is published from my university, from St. Andrews, called Global Intellectual History. I started a book with the German publisher De Gruyter on critical readings in global intellectual history. And there have been other kind of such movements in democratizing and going beyond non-Eurocentrism in terms of intellectual history. For example, until very recently, the premier book series on intellectual history in the Euro-American Academy, where they mostly published European American white intellectual history. For example, publishers like Cambridge University Press or University of Pennsylvania Press, they had series on intellectual history, but what they meant by intellectual history was by and large, largely white intellectual history. I was able to just found very recently, I co-edited and founded a series with Cambridge University Press on South Asian intellectual history, which to the best of my knowledge is the first university series, first book series explicitly dedicated to a non-Western, non-white world region published by a major English language university press. Meanwhile, older journals in the field like Modern Intellectual History, Journal of the History of Ideas, as well as these series that I had mentioned, like Ideas in Context and so on, have also gradually began, slowly, but gradually began to publish works on Indian, Arab, Chinese, Japanese, etc. intellectual history as well. So there is a kind of effort to diversify and decolonize the field, going beyond Eurocentrism. Very exciting books have been appearing in such interesting fields as Black Atlantic intellectual history, Indigenous Hawaiian intellectual history, Sub-Saharan African intellectual history. So a lot of really interesting things are happening where people are realizing we need to study political and social thought beyond Britain and France and Germany, but look at Sub-Saharan Africa, Indigenous Hawaiian thought, thought produced by thinkers in the Caribbean, and so on. Now, a lot of this kind of transformation in the politics of book publishing also has to do with the changing complexion of universities in Europe and America, and particularly with the nature of the student body. So increasingly, a lot of our students are coming from non-Western countries. They are often non-white students coming, for example, from China, from the Arab world, from India, from other places. So just this year, for example, in the main global social and political thought program that I run, there are students not just from Europe and America, but also from Kurdistan, from China, from India, from Russia, and so on. Now, what this basically means, as students kind of move across countries, there is also student demand to know more about global history. Students in Western universities are not content anymore to just study the history of Britain and France and Italy and Germany and North America. They want to study about the history of other parts of the world. And that is why in St. Andrews, a program was devised very recently called Global Social and Political Thought, which I direct together with Margareta Weissman, who's a specialist on Russian literature of the 19th century. And this program, to be honest, I think is quite unique in the world in terms of the fact that it actually wants to study political and social thought in non-Eurocentric ways, in truly global ways. And it's not just a history program. We also have tutors from several other disciplines, including international relations, classics, anthropology, economics, management, biology, and so on. So it's a very interdisciplinary course where we push the boundaries of what we understand as thought, where we put, for example, Indian thought into conversation with thought coming out from South America, from China, from Japan, the Arab world, and so on. And we have tutors with regional expertise from very different parts of the world, bringing these issues into global conversation with each other. And the students are really exciting. I mean, they are excited themselves to debate, learn, not just learn more about global history, but think in global ways. For example, just yesterday, I was talking to a student from Kurdistan who's very interested in bringing Kurdish political thought into conversation with global thinking about democracy, which I think is and particularly she's interested in doing this from a feminist perspective, which was really fascinating to think about. Now, what all of this also implies is that we need to also seriously engage with the question of decolonizing intellectual history. And decolonizing the curriculum is a big movement in Britain, which of course, I mean, in the 19th and early 20th century, it had the biggest empire the world has ever seen. But Britain is increasingly a multiracial, multicultural country. And we get, and there is a lot of student politics as well about decolonizing the curriculum, about removing Eurocentrism from the curriculum. And our university has been very responsive to those demands. And we are often asked, like, what are we doing to decolonize the curriculum? And that is the main issue that I now want to think about, that what would decolonizing the curriculum mean in terms of intellectual history. And a lot of the ideas come about partly from my experiments with teaching global intellectual history at President's University, Calcutta, where I taught for 4 years. And to the best of my knowledge, I was the first one to design and teach programs on global intellectual history in India. This happened in Presidency. I taught 2 programs, one focused on early modern connections between Europe and India, and the other one on late modern 19th and 20th century connections between South Asia and Europe. In St. Andrews, as I said, I direct this program called Global Social and Political Thought. And a lot of what I'm going to say comes out of things that have been instigated to think about by my students who have very strong political concerns, whether it be environmentalist, feminist, queer, anti-racist, decolonial, different kinds of radical thinking. So my basic argument would be here that decolonizing intellectual history cannot mean simply supplementing or even substituting in the classroom the study of elite white men with elite brown men, the teaching of canonical European texts with canonical South or East Asian texts. So decolonizing the curriculum cannot just mean we replace, let us say, Shakespeare with Kalidasa or Aristotle with Kautilya. There's a problem involved there. It cannot be reduced to appointments of a few elite non-white academics to positions in intellectual history, ticking the diversity box, just appoint one African, one Indian, and you have ticked the diversity box, while keeping old hierarchies of academic power intact. Because the basic question is, how would replacing Hobbes with Kautilya in the curriculum really decolonize anything? Kautilya's statecraft was as bent on exploiting human and non-human beings as the Hobbesian statecraft was. Studying Ottoman, Qing, or Tokugawa intellectual history, intellectual histories of Anatolia, of China, or Japan, histories of their ruling classes, is not intrinsically emancipatory. There's nothing intrinsically freedom-bearing about studying the histories of non-white ruling classes. An appropriate analogy for the logic of canon/personal substitution is supplied by many post-colonial Asian, African, and Latin American states, which simply took over the governmental military machinery of the European powers and enthusiastically robbed their poorer citizens, exterminated minorities, and decimated indigenous environments in the name of progress. So my basic point is, just as in a way decolonization often involved simply replacing white ruling classes with brown ruling classes, the task of diversifying intellectual history in a similar way cannot be reduced to just removing a few white men and putting a few elite brown men there. Just remove Hobbes, put in Kautilya, remove Machiavelli, put in Jawaharlal Nehru. That is not adequate decolonization, because that still keeps the elite male power privilege in terms of intellectual history intact, in terms of who is considered as a thinker and who is not. An elite politician is considered a thinker, while a peasant or a woman is not considered a thinker. And that is intrinsically discriminatory. And so I would basically argue that a deeper struggle is necessary against what the Indian Dalit thinker Monoranjan Bapari calls Prabhutvakari Chintadhara, the lording consciousness. So for Bapari, as for many other contemporary Indian thinkers, the post-colonial state has entrenched the domination of capital and the property classes. So rather than being able to remove the power of capitalists and landlords, the post-colonial state has actually often preserved their power. Hence, for them, radical political thought must entail a conjoint critique of state and capital. Now, taking a cue from anti-imperialist Indian thinking, we must study the resistant consciousness of beings subalternized by state and capital. And this is particularly important in our present context, where we obviously see a lot of state violence, whether in South Asia or across the world, but we also see a lot of violence done by capital, not just on human laborers, but also on non-human species. So many scholars today speak about the current age, the age of global warming, of the climate crisis. If capitalism is allowed to run its course as it is at the moment, the world is going to be destroyed because of global warming, because of the climate crisis, because of extinction of species. As the sea levels rise, countries like Bangladesh or Fiji will get drowned. There will be climate refugees. There are already climate refugees. A lot of species are getting extinct because of unbridled industrialization. Indigenous communities, whether it be Adivasis in India or Aboriginals in Australia or the Native Americans in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil are threatened by unbridled industrialization. So if capitalism is allowed to run its course as it is, uncontrolled, and particularly neoliberal capitalism, which is basically capitalism torn away from any sort of facade or welfare state politics, then the very survival of life is at stake. And that is what scholars often refer to as the age of the Capitalocene, the age when capital is dominant in an unparalleled manner. Many scholars also see this as the age of the Necrocene, the age of death. Now, what I basically want to argue that there is something to be said about a conjoined critique of state and capital. So the violence which is committed by states against, indigenous populations, subaltern classes, minorities, and the violence which is done by capital on humans as well as on non-humans. These two types of violence are actually conjoined forms. They are twins, basically. And this is, and to use the Bengali term, there is a kind of ochinto bhedabhed between them. There is a difference, a bhed, but there is also an abhed, a non-difference, and it's ochinto bhedabhed. So the way that I argue this is through a reference to Hegel, the great German philosopher of the early 19th century, and particularly the dialectic, which has been very central to the genesis of Marxism, but also to post-colonial thinking, whether it's Frantz Fanon or Ronald Go, which is what in English is often called the master-slave dialectic. But in German, the terms are Herr and Knecht, Herr meaning the lord or master, Knecht meaning bondsman, but often in English and French, it's translated as slave. So in his famous book, Phenomenology of Spirit, published in 1807, Hegel describes this dialectic. So it's a dialectic, basically, there are two beings who encounter each other, and both don't want to give recognition to the other, but they want recognition for themselves. And this leads to a kind of fight to the death, where ultimately one being surrenders. And the one who surrenders in fear of death, whom Hegel describes in eerie terms, gives you goosebumps, death the absolute master. So in fear of death, one of the beings submits, and that person, that being, becomes the knecht, the bondsman or the slave, and the person who doesn't submit, that's the lord. Now, I would argue that this dialectic can be seen as the founding moment of both state and property, because state sovereignty involves coercive power. I mean, in Bavarian terms, it's the monopoly of legitimate violence. The state is violence embodied. So the state also reduces beings into subjects through violence, but so does capital. I mean, when capital converts human beings into uprooted proletarianized laborers, or when capital destroys animals, plants, forests, lakes, mountains in the name of industrial development, that's basically, again, the threat of death. It's coercion. So there is something to be said for connecting state and capital as two conjoined avatars of coercion, of violence, of death, the absolute master. In his book, Outlines of the Philosophy of Right, published in 1820, Hegel elaborates that the sovereign ruler says, I will. In German, it's a very strong word, ich will. So the sovereign ruler says, I will, but also every property owner stamps his will on what he claims as his possession. So this is mine. In Sanskrit, we call this mamedam. In Mahabharata, in Kautilya, often the term which is used at the heart of property is the idea of mamedam, mama idam, this is mine. In Latin, meum, this is mine, absolute property right. And the state similarly says, my subjects, this is my will. Now, at the heart of this is a tremendous violence. And Hegel says, I'm just giving the quotation from Hegel, that what is at the root of property? Hegel says, I give, I meaning the property owner, I give to it being the property, which can be a human being, like a slave, or a non-human being, like a pet cat or dog, or a cow or a horse, but can also be, of course, a piece of land or something like that. I give to it a soul other than the one it had before. I give to it my soul. So the possessive will at the heart of property is basically removing the souls of beings, desouling them, making them what I call unbeing. So removing the souls of animals, of plants, in slavery also of humans. And to be honest, I mean, Marx, of course, speaks of proletarianized labor also as a kind of slavery. It's a wage slavery, where slaves are, where the workers have nominal freedom, but are exploited from day to night. So at the heart of property making, profit accumulation, accumulation of profit by capitalists, by the bourgeoisie, by the landlords, is this tremendous process of what I call desouling, of unsouling, of removing the souls of beings. And that is what basically Hegel is speaking about. Now, Marx, of course, famously says in Capital that another soul, the German is eine andere Seele, another soul animates and haunts the being that is possessed. And for Marx, this is the soul of capital, die Kapitalseele. Now, of course, capital as such does not have a soul in the way that human beings have. But Marx is saying that it's the logic of capital to dominate, the endless logic of profit making. And what is capitalism? Capitalism is the generalization of the commodity form. Everything can be bought and sold. Nothing is sacred, no emotion, no religion, nothing is sacred, because everything is made subordinate to the rule of capital. Profit making is the only allowable and sacrosanct value. That is capitalism, the generalization of the commodity form. Now, for Marx, the soul of capital, die Kapitalseele, is also like a vampire. And Marx famously says, what is capital? It is dead labor living vampire-like on living labor. And that is why many of you would know in Naxalite discourse, capitalists were often described by terms like Roktotosha and Noropishat and so on. There is a vampirical logic to capital. Now, what I'm basically arguing then is that the sovereign / the possessive will, and I'm arguing that the state and capital are actually conjoined entities, Ochinto Bheda Bhed. The sovereign / possessive will uproots people from their lands. Think about the genocidal colonization of the Americas, the kind of violence that has been done against subaltern populations in India. The sovereign possessive will uproots people from their lands, destroys forests, pollutes air and water, enslaves and slaughters animals, suppresses worker struggles. Violence transforms beings into subjects to be ruled, into resources for extracting value, into commodities to be produced and consumed. As the epoch of general commodification, the transformation of all or most social relations into relations of commodity production and exchange for the pursuit of naked profit, the age of capital is the age of unbeing. Justin McBrien calls our era the Necrocene. King capital presides over the 6th mass extinction of species. I mean, species are getting extinct at an alarming rate, as has never happened for thousands and thousands of years before. Now, the question that I now want to ask is, given the current alarming political situation in terms of racial injustice, in terms of caste violence, in terms of violence against minorities, and of course, violence against non-human animals and plants, can we think of decolonizing political thought as a way of overcoming the planetary crisis? And the reason, of course, is if we obsess ourselves with political thinkers of European origin, Baudin, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and so on, they would not help us much here. Because, for example, if you look at figures like Baudin or at Hobbes, they were theorists of a very absolutist state power. Or if you look at somebody like Locke, Locke is not just a theory of property, is not just a theorist of property and capital. He's also somebody who basically justifies colonization of the Americas and justifies slavery. So I'm not sure that just reading Locke helps us very much in imagining a decolonial democratic political thought. This thinker who basically, legitimized male power over women, white power over non-white populations, justified slavery, and that kind of stuff. Now, how do we then think with anti-colonial, non-Western political thought? Can it actually help us to overcome these very powerful structures, very toxic structures of state and capital? So in his latest book, Climate of History, Dipesh Chakraborty, who needs no introduction, all of you would be familiar with him, Dipesh Chakraborty argues that anti-colonial Asian and African intellectuals and state builders were invested in exploiting the environment to achieve human prosperity. They shared with Europeans a fundamental belief in technological growth. So Dipesh Chakraborty casts Jawaharlal Nehru, first Prime Minister of independent India, as a paradigmatic thinker here. For Chakraborty, the goal of redistributive justice, stemming out of socialist, anti-post-colonial, and feminist discourses about subaltern well-being, seems oppositional to environmentalist concerns. So basically the argument goes, if poor Indians, Chinese, Africans demand the same living standards as Europeans and Americans, fuel-sucking air conditioners and cars, this spells ecological disaster. So basically the argument goes that for Chakraborty, there is an opposition between anti-colonial or post-colonial demands for justice, that non-white peoples like Indians, Chinese, Africans have the same living standards as white Europeans or Americans. This demand for decolonial justice or anti-colonial justice or post-colonial justice is fundamentally at odds with the goal of preventing climate change. Because, you know, if everyone wants industrialization, if everybody wants refrigerators and air conditioners and cars, then, I mean, in terms of the whole carbon imprint of that, in terms of the carbon emission of fuels and so on, the impact on the environment would be utterly catastrophic. So human justice and environment in Dipesh Chakraborty's view are actually oppositional to each other. Now, I want to challenge this because I do differ from Dipesh Chakraborty's views quite substantially by focusing on two things. The first question is that when we think about human democracy, is it really enough to think in a European way, where democracy becomes equal to unbridled industrialization? You know, basically the kind of mixed economy that Jawaharlal Nehru was advocating. Is that the proper way to think about democracy? Or is there something that we might call green democracy, a democracy which is not bent on destroying the environment, but actually lives in sustainability with it? And I think for that reason, what I would insist on, unlike Dipesh Chakraborty, is that there is a very long genealogy to democracy, which Dipesh Chakraborty doesn't reckon with. For Dipesh Chakraborty, as for many other sort of Western-trained Indian scholars, the history of democracy in India becomes reduced to figures like Nehru and Gandhi and so on. Now, I'm not saying that these figures are not important, they're extremely important, but the history of Indian democracy cannot be reduced to the history of the Indian Parliament or the Indian Constitution. There's a much longer history of Indian democracy, which is non-Eurocentric in nature. And for this, we actually need to, of course, go back to the very ancient of times. We know from Sanskrit texts, from Pali texts, from Prakrit texts, that there were non-monarchic city-states in India, which were, I mean, they were not absolute democracy, but neither was ancient Athens. In ancient Athens as well, democracy did not mean equal rights for women or slaves, but it did mean a public sphere based, to some extent at least, on consensual deliberation and discussion and debate between citizens. And this kind of stuff we also have in ancient India. We have a lot of Sanskrit, Prakrit, and Pali texts testifying to these non-monarchic polities. We have evidence, for example, from the Mahabharata. We have evidence from Kautilya's Arthashastra. The Buddha himself modeled his Sangha, his monastic order, on the basis of the Gana Sanghas, the non-monarchic polities. But additionally, we also actually have a lot of European sources. We have Greek and Roman sources using the term democracy, actually, demokratia, the Greek term, people's rule, to refer to a lot of Indian city-states of ancient times. So, for example, Diodorus Siculus, who is from the 1st century BC, talks about Indian cities as dissolving kingly hegemony and democratizing their governance. The term is demokratia. The Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus from the 1st century AD speaks of an Indian people, gens, who were ruled, and notice the term, who were ruled by the command of the people and not of kings. And the word for people here is populus, from where we get the word popular. The Greek scholar administrator Arrian in the 2nd century AD described Indian cities that were self-governing. The term for self-governing here is autonomos, from where we get the word autonomous. So these Indian cities were autonomous, they were not ruled by kings. So there is an established Indian kind of South Asian history towards thinking of indigenous democracy, which goes far longer. I mean, these are texts, you know, dating more than 2,000 years old, far longer than, you know, Western kind of ideas about parliamentarianism, constitutionalism, and so on. Now, for those of you who are familiar with early modern history, obviously in the late 17th and 18th century, the Sikh agrarian revolution was very much in the 18th century a non-monarchic revolution. The Sikhs initially set up non-monarchic republican polities. And there has been some really great scholarship on that in recent years. In Tripura, if you look at the state chronicle, the Rajmala, the people, the term for the people used in the Rajmala is Lok or Jano, Shorbolok, Shobe. The people, so everyone, Shobe, all the people, Shorbolok, or people, Lok or Jano, they are described as political agents who depose tyrants, who select new rulers, and who are essential to the management of the polity, not just kings. If you look at a lot of peasant communities across India, like the Jat peasants of northern India, or the indigenous scheduled tribe communities of Nagaland and Assam, Yelewutas, Shondaudi, etc., have worked on many of these communities. They had very sophisticated forms of democratic decision making far before the colonial period. And Naga democracy, democracy among Adivasi communities, scheduled tribe communities of Assam, they still persist today, despite the kind of imposition of Western forms of state sovereignty above them. Now, basically, my argument would be that we need to think with these indigenous forms of community, which have persisted for centuries, perhaps for millennia, in order to think about rejuvenating democracy today from below, from subaltern communities, particularly Dalit, Bahujan, Adivasi, minority communities, and thinking of democracy from below against the kind of violent state, majoritarian state, and capitalist power, which is entrenched by both colonial as well as post-colonial regimes. Now, in order to take this into account, I would argue so far as to say that in India, and surely elsewhere too, a lot of anti-colonial politics was often anarchist, seeking to overthrow the European colonial state capital nexus rather than preserve it. Now, there's a wonderful book on this by Maya Ramnath called Decolonizing Anarchism. Now, if you look at the writings of Rabindranath Tagore, if you look at the writings of Gandhi, if you look at the writings of Nazrul Islam, it's very, very clear that they don't just want to replace the white European British state by another Indian brown state. They actually want to critique and overcome the state form altogether. And in the writings of Gandhi, in the writings of Tagore, in the writings of Nazrul, we find extremely powerful critiques of racial colonial capitalism, of this kind of unbridled focus on industrial growth and development. But this was all intellectual resources which were abandoned in the post-colonial period by the ruling classes. So my basic argument is the post-colonial state was a betrayal more than a realization of many anti-colonial dreams. Nehruvian developmentalist ideology won only through tremendous violence, by suppressing popular revolutions in Telangana and Tripura, by submerging the anti-statist thought of figures like Gandhi and Nazrul Islam, by suppressing the decolonial anti-extractivist environmentalism of Rabindranath Tagore, think about Dr. Korobi, through settler colonial operations from Northeast and Central India to the Andamans and Kashmir. If strongman leadership and predatory capital conjoined today from Hindu nationalist India to Turkey, the fatal bond has a prehistory. Similarly, Indian consumption aspirations today, air conditioners to survive in a fossil fuel heated world, cars to bypass an underfunded public transport system, cannot be understood without factoring in the prior violence of capital. So basically my argument is that despite all these great noble dreams of overcoming state and capital which were produced during the anti-colonial movement, what happens in the post-colonial period is in a way decolonization is just half done. The kind of violent European state and European capital is overthrown, but the state and capital as such are still preserved. They are preserved under the leadership of Indian ruling classes who are working within a broader global empire of, in the Cold War period, of America, of the Soviet Union, and today, of course, with the Soviet Union gone, it's largely they're working as subordinate collaborators, comprador bourgeoisie of the Western powers, or white powers. So basically, in post-colonial and so-called communist states like the Soviet Union and China, either the state or a condominium of the state and the native bourgeoisie served as the custodian of capital. So in Soviet Union and China, classically it was the state which was the hyper-capitalist. In so-called mixed economies like India, it was the state existing with the native bourgeoisie who were responsible for the political economic control. These polities could not abolish the commodity form, the wage form, or indeed the state form. human and non-human beings continued to be exploited with tragic rigor. Moishe Postone, has a very noted Marxian theorist, has aptly criticized Soviet and other forms of state capitalism for merely achieving redistribution of wealth, the reduction of social inequality, without a more profound attack on the logic of capitalist production itself. So basically, Postone's argument is Soviet Union, China, and I would argue Nehruvian India, etc., could not abolish capitalism. What they did was to bring capitalism under the control of the state, but they could not abolish the logic of industrial growth itself, which continued to exploit human and non-human beings. And the horrors of Stalinist Soviet Union, the horrors of capitalist China, of state capitalist China, or of Nehruvian India have to be attributed to this fundamental problem. So Marx, of course, in Capital talks about the revolution as would be happening when the expropriators would be expropriated. But I would differ from Marx, because if the capitalist / colonial expropriators are only expropriated, let's say, the British landlords or the British coal miners are just expropriated, the logic of expropriation is still preserved rather than annihilated. So for example, if the coal mines in Eastern India were initially owned by the British, and then the Indian state basically just nationalizes them, that doesn't solve the problem that coal mine continues to exploit lower caste and Adivasi miners, and also creates enormously to global warming. I mean, coal mining is one of the largest causes of global warming. So just expropriating the colonial expropriators doesn't solve the problem of violence. Clearly, political economic thought primarily focused on redistribution, as popularized today by Thomas Piketty, needs to be surpassed. So what is my solution? My argument is to complete decolonization, the modern sovereign state form, colonial origin across large stretches of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. I mean, most states in Asia, Africa, and the Americas are colonial origin states, needs to be dismantled. For inspiration, and this is again where I go back to the issue of decolonizing political theory, decolonizing what we mean by democracy. For inspiration, we must look to thinkers other than Lenin, Nehru, Sukarno, or Nasser. Contemporary capitalist value extraction draws upon racial colonial as well as older pre-colonial hierarchies. Decolonization should involve resisting such degradation of beings, combating Manu, whom I'm using as a shorthand for traditional hierarchy, as well as Milton Friedman, a shorthand for neoliberal capitalism. Intellectual historians have hitherto brilliantly interpreted how capitalist ideas were born. They must now contribute to changing this world. Now, I would argue that subaltern studies theory can inspire us here immensely. Ranajit Guha, Parthu Chatterjee, and so on saw subaltern community, especially peasant community, as the social form oppositional to colonial capital. So to oppose capital, you need human beings to bond with each other, to support each other against capitalist exploitation. And especially, I mean, peasant communities in South Asia and the non-Western, non-white world have generally been demographically extremely important here. One also thinks about peasant politics as extremely important in India today. While researching some of these communities, I have become convinced that they offer the most successful models for resisting the state capital nexus. So let us consider the Rajbangshis, one of the largest scheduled caste or Dalit peasant communities of India. I worked on the Rajbangshis in my book, The Mortal God. Rajbangshis in colonial Bengal condemned capitalists for stealing opohoron, their labor, strom, and land. Peasant labor, they argued, created value and profit, labh, but the companies did not fairly recompense labor value, strom mulya. In retaliation, Rajbangshis self-organized community education, healthcare, finance, and agrarian improvements. Politicians like Panchanan Burma successfully pressured the state to give lower caste communities reservations and welfare support in legislative representation, education, and employment. Now, this was not just a practical thing, it also had ramifications in terms of political theory. Interwar era Rajbangshis theorized solidarity as transition from an atomistic prakriti, nature, via Prabhu Shashun, rule by master, and Samaj Shashun, rule by society, to Atto Shashun, self-rule, and Atto Shakti, self-power. So from a movement from rule of master, Prabhu Shashon, then rule of society, Samaj Shashon, and finally the goal is to achieve self-rule, Atma Shashon, Atma Shakti. The final goal of dialectical struggle was the abolition of all government, Shashon. All government was to be finally negated to attain fullness of being, Purnotto. So this is an amazingly sophisticated political theory produced by peasants in their community meetings in Rangpur and other places of northern Bengal, basically in order to resist the colonial state and racial colonial high caste capitalism, the domination of whites as well as high caste Bengalis, by producing this alternative social form which is coexisting with state and capital, but ultimately carving out their own indigenous political society, which aspires for the fullness of political and social existence, and ultimately the negation of any kind of heteronymous government. In nearby Tripura, indigenous / scheduled tribe, Adivasi, Highlander shifting cultivators, spearheaded by actors like Dasharat Deb, conceptualized a subaltern constitutionalism, enacting self-legislation, Vidhi Rachana, and counter-government, Palta Sarkar, against the Nehruvian state and high caste Indian Bengali elites. So when the Bengali elites were oppressing or the Indian elites were oppressing the indigenous peoples, they evolved a very sophisticated alternative political form and political thought. Through fierce struggles, they won significant territorial autonomy. Now, much of this counter-hegemonic political thought is not only directed against brutally violent centralized state sovereignty, but also helps us to overcome anthropocentrism by establishing solidarities between humans and non-humans. So, for example, Tripura's pre-colonial chronicle Rajmala advocated a general principle of prani ahingshan, not harming beings, while normativizing Highlander rebellion against rulers who slaughtered humans and animals. So if rulers slaughter humans and animals, basically Rajmala says we have to oppose that because the cardinal value is prani ahingsha, not harming beings. You're all familiar with songs attributed to the 15th century Indian Muslim believer Saint Kabir. Kabir repeatedly condemns violence against both humans and non-humans. He speaks about samata, equivalence between men and women, but also between humans and non-humans. Kabir urges human beings to regard all as a living being like oneself. The Hindi is beautiful. Apna sa jeev sabko jane, and to practice daya, mercy. Peasant pastoral communities in colonial India often authored texts portraying cattle as divine beings deserving care. So these are all very sophisticated forms of political thought, which are much more environmentally, what we would today call environmentally friendly, than the kind of state capitalist thought associated with figures like Buddha or Hobbes and so on. I need about 10 more minutes. I'm coming to a conclusion now. More recently, the Dongria Khons of Orissa have successfully defended the mountain Niyamgiri, realm of their ancestor god Niyam Raja, from the neo-colonial capitalist mining corporation Vedanta. Maori politics in New Zealand has enabled the ancestor river Wanganui to acquire legal personhood and protection against settler colonial encroachments. In Bhutan, the local discourses recognize yaks as persons, as people, and regard land as owned by gods and spirits, thereby curtailing capitalist interventions. So all of these are ways of thinking about political thought and what I would call multi-species democracy. It's a demos, a democracy where it's not just the rights of human beings, of elites, of ruling classes, of men, which is at stake, but the well-being of many other non-humans as well. To use the famous Buddhist phrase, which is very often invoked in Dalit Bahujan discourse today, Bahujana Hitaya Bahujana Sukhaya, for the well-being of many, for the happiness of the many. I mean, this is the strength of a lot of these subaltern political social thought. Now, a lot of the focus on classical political theory has tended to be on humans, because humans were seen as the privileged species which could differentiate between friend and enemy, between justice and injustice. But actually, a lot of recent scientific and ethnographic research has shown how non-human animals also can distinguish between just and unjust behavior, between friends and enemies. For example, Tom Van Duren's work on crows shows how crows can distinguish between fair and unfair behavior. So they also have concepts of justice. Crows know what is just and what is not just. And they innovate use of tools. One of my colleagues in St. Andrews, Luke Rendell, has co-authored a book on whales and dolphins, showing how whales and dolphins have cultural lives. They can transmit things like songs, particular language forms. They know when the other person is, like a human, is behaving unfairly with them. Even fungi have been shown, Sheldrake's work shows even fungi make choices and solve problems. Now, what all of this means is that we need to entirely reconceptualize and refigure intellectual history by thinking of non-humans not just as objects who are separate and lower than humans, but as also thinking beings. Intellectual historians should, of course, also draw insights from feminist and queer thought. Marxist feminists like Tithi Bhattacharya counterpose life-making against capitalist thing-making and profit creation. Françoise Vergès and Sylvia Tamale connect decolonial and feminist visions. Now, in my book, I've shown the importance of the political and social thought of figures like Begum Rokeya, Sarojini Naidu, Nivedita, and others, how women conceptualize political and social thought and female solidarity. That is something which has also been ignored by traditional male political intellectual history. I'm currently, I have worked last year with students who carved out very interesting anti-imperialist agendas of queer and trans intellectual history. So one of my students, Grey Black, read gay dating apps as techno-colonial texts that commodify, racialize, and animalize queer bodies while denigrating the animal. Another of my students, I supervised her dissertation, Mae Morgan, interpreted American transphobia as white supremacist thought and antithetically highlighted the relation between trans, feminist, anti-fascist, and anarchist political discourses. Now, as predatory capital bears its colonial fangs from Dakota to Orissa, from indigenous North America and the whole issue of the Dakota pipeline to Orissa to Niamgiri, there's also resistance spanning across the world, from Amazon rainforest to Aboriginal Australia. Dipesh Chakraborty speaks of a negative universal, a universal that arises from a shared sense of catastrophe as the required thought for this current age of climate crisis, the Anthropocene. I would argue that we need something far more ambitious, political thought directly nourished by subaltern consciousness. So basically, let us be clear. Jean-François Lyotard defined the postmodern condition as based on incredulity to meta-narratives. You know, you are suspicious of any kind of big narrative, whether it be about Marxism or revolution or whatever. I think the postmodern age of incredulity to meta-narratives is over. Amitav Ghosh, the famous novelist on climate change, speaks of a great derangement that plagues us, that mandates collective imagining during this climate emergency. Shubhatri Dasgupta diagnoses anguish against injustice as the springboard for public intellection and empathy. Intellectual historians can help in weaving the poetry of the future. This is the term I'm obviously drawing from Marx. Marx, in the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, speaks about revolution as the poetry of the future. I think that intellectual historians can help us in weaving the poetry of the future by drawing from the past. So Marx says the poetry of the future cannot draw from the past, but I do think it can draw. It can draw from the history of the Rajbangshis, of Kabir, of Tripura, and so on. It can draw from the past. And help us in linking the heterogeneous coalitions that are evolving across the world, you know, from Dalit Bahujan movements to Black Lives Matter. Some will want to circumscribe state and capital, others to overthrow them. We can walk part of the path together. We shall study and correct and connect insurrectionary political thought emerging from indigenous societies, Black congregations, Dalit public spheres, anti-extractivist struggles, queer communities, feminist strikes. One link at a time, one mountain, one river, one forest, one injured species, one vulnerable minority at a time. We must reverse the chains of subject and commodity making, of de-souling that have precipitated the great unbeing. Niamgiri, Wanganui, and Black Lives Matter embody political ontologies where beings are affirmed as beings, not as commodities, not as things that can be bought and sold. To borrow words from the Black theologian M. Sean Copeland, they embody a cry of presence. This is a long revolution, rather than the messianic overcoming that the 20th century posed faith in. So Hegel, of course, speaks of the bureaucracy as the universal class, whose interests are the universal interests. Marx transforms this into the proletariat by thinking of the proletariat as the universal class, whose interest is the universal interest. But we know that the way that the proletariat was classically imagined, white male working class, or perhaps also non-white male working class, this is not the way that we can understand revolution today. Because in Europe and North America, the working class has been destroyed by neoliberalism to a significant extent. A lot of workers are not male. They are not industrial factory workers, but peasants, tribal peoples, indigenous peoples, servants, various kinds of workers. So we cannot think of the proletariat as a homogeneous entity in the way that the Hegelian Marx did. We have to think about revolution through a much more complex heterogeneous coalition of subaltern humans and non-human beings. Together with the anthropologist Jelle Wouters, I have just finished writing a pamphlet calling for a revitalization of subalternist thinking. The urgent task of decolonizing intellectual history, of subaltern intellectual history, entails learning from and decolonizing political theory, which was, to go back to my title of my talk, entails learning from and energizing radical political communities, including, again, the focus of my talk, decolonizing how we think about the roots of Indian democracy by taking Indian subaltern politics, Rajbangshis, Tripuris, Nagas, etc., far more seriously as constitutive of democracy. We need to ally them to fight against the empire of capital by enunciating non-exploitative interdependence and mutual aid between beings. One cannot stop at the negative universal of the Anthropocene. Instead, we must overcome the Capitalocene, the violent age of capital, by being in common, by thinking in assembly. In recognizing the interdependence between beings, we shall reconstitute being. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. It was really an excellent presentation. We have some questions for you. Should I place?
Yes, please.
Question from Debraj Chakraborty, Barhampur Girls College, Murshidabad. Would you share your views on medieval India's way of writing in terms of intellectual history other than court history?
Thank you for that very interesting question. That's a really very inspiring question, because when we speak about medieval Indian political and social thought, often it tends to focus on figures who are ruling classes. Figures like, for example, Barani or Abul Fazl. I mean, these are people who are basically legitimizing state regimes. Or if you're looking at, for example, figures like the people who wrote the Rajput Chronicles, again, they are legitimizing Rajput rulership. Now, how do we think about medieval political and social thought, not from the perspective of these ruling classes, these state elites, but from alternative perspectives? So I have written a bit on Bengal. For Bengal, I think we can use, for example, the Mongol Kampus. So if you take texts like Chondi Mongol, which tell us about Kalketu, who was, Mukunda describes Kalketu as basically a hunter. And in the famous words, Keho nahi sporsho kore jatte chuar. So a person who is obviously what today we would call, coming from a Dalit Adivasi background, Kalketu, he's the hero of this poem. So and also it's not just humans. I mean, if you look at Chondi Mongol, non-humans, animals also play a very important role. So in one of my articles, I've looked at how the animals come together and request Chondi to transform them from a condition of fear, shashanko, to a condition of non-fear, niratanko. And then they form a political apparatus together with the help of goddess Chondi. And then, of course, you have Kalketu's story, and Kalketu's story also has a caste dimension in the way that Kalketu's kingdom is attacked by a high caste ruler. So there's very interesting multi-species politics happening here. And I would say traditionally, why should we think of medieval or early modern political thought only through the lens of Abul Fazl or Barani or Rajput court chroniclers? Why should we not take Mongol Kampus as very interesting sources of political thought? And the same would be true of other texts, like, for example, if you take the text like the Rai Mongol. Rai Mongol is again a very interesting genre of text which talk about the relation between a Muslim saint, Ghazi saint, Barakhan Ghazi, and Dokhin Rai, the Tiger King. And it speaks about, I was recently writing about this, it speaks about a kind of friendship pact between the two, which is also about human-non-human relation. It's about the human-tiger coexistence within the forest. So I think looking at these texts would be very interesting. Going to northern India, for example, the songs which are attributed to saints like Kabir or Dadu are absolutely fascinating texts of political and social thought, because they talk about equality, they talk about justice, they talk about relation between men and women, humans and non-humans. They critique Brahmanical caste hierarchy and patriarchy. And I think we should all take them very seriously as intellectual history, going beyond the status bias that has been very fundamental and very problematic in our conventional historical gaze.
Another question from Argo Mukherjee, Department of English, APC Roy Government College, North Bengal University. He asks, sir, please clarify the concept of decolonialism theories.
Yeah, thank you very much for that very interesting question again. So, I mean, it's very difficult to explain decoloniality in this short time frame of the talk. But basically, I mean, if you look at a lot of post-colonial thinking, for example, Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, one could argue that figures like Dipesh Chakraborty, etc., can also be seen in a broad sense as post-colonial thinkers. They were basically writing from a point of dissatisfaction with how the post-colonial state was not able to remove the kind of state capital nexus that colonialism had brought about. And you have other figures like Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire and so on as well. Decolonial thinking has come up more recently, often instigated by scholars from South America who are very interested in looking at the continuing effects of settler colonialism as well as other kinds of colonialism. And I've been very inspired by figures who have looked at Brazil and Peru and Ecuador and Bolivia and so on, like Marisol de la Cadena, Arturo Escobar, and so on, Mario Blazer. Basically, what is common to, in a way, the post-colonial impetus and the decolonial impetus is to say that colonialism is not over. The economic effects of colonialism, this violent state structures of colonialism, the cultural subordination of subaltern beings by colonialism, all these have been continued by many of the ruling classes in ostensibly post-colonial polities. And then, therefore, in a way, if we argue decolonization is not over, then what does decolonizing knowledge mean? Decolonizing political theory mean? This is something that all these scholars are invested in thinking about. And that is kind of what I wanted to focus on as well. Some of the South American scholars talk about sort of thinking with indigenous political ontologies. That how do we conceptualize being? Do we, for example, think of a non-human being as just a commodity? But in many South American societies, people think of non-human beings as persons. So a jaguar or a monkey would be seen as a person. This is what in South America is called perspectivism. Now, if that is the case, then how can we think with this kind of indigenous political ontology, where the animal is not a commodity, not something that can be hunted just at will, but is a person? How can we use this to inform our critiques of state and capital? And that is what I was trying to do today as well, by putting that sort of debates from South America into conversation with subaltern studies theory. In Bolivia recently, there was a declaration of the rights of the Mother Earth, which is very interesting because it goes beyond human rights to talk about the rights of Mother Earth and also the rights of communities, of ecosystems, of multi-being, multi-species kind of life forms. I think those are all part of the decolonial debate that I was alluding to.
That's all. We have no more questions. Once again, I would like to express my sincere regards from the entire department, Sripat Singh College, and it was really an insightful and thought-provoking lecture indeed. Thank you, sir, and I believe that very soon we will meet in such academic sessions. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. May. Thank you. And thank you to everyone in the audience and for the wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I have some announcement for the participants that tomorrow we will meet at 3 p.m. for the next session, and the feedback link will be provided during the session, and the filling up of a feedback link is mandatory to get an e-certificate, and so please be there on time, and the oral presentation will be done according to the schedule. And now this is the time for vote of thanks. I invite my dear colleague, Sri Shapon Kumar Sarkar, to give the vote of thanks. Shapon da, unmute করুন।
হ্যালো,
হ্যাঁ, শোনা যাচ্ছে এবার।
হ্যালো,
আনমিউট করুন, স্বপন দা, আনমিউট করুন। স্বপন দা,
হ্যাঁ বল, শোনা যাচ্ছে, আনমিউট করুন।
আনমিউট।
হ্যাঁ, ইয়েস ইয়েস।
আনমিউট করেছি।
হ্যাঁ বলুন বলুন।
স্যার মিউট আছেন।
আবার মিউট হয়ে গেছে।
Sir, please unmute. Sir, please unmute. Unmute করুন স্যার।
আনমিউট হয়ে গেছে, মিউট হয়ে গেছে, আনমিউট করুন।
স্যার লিভ করেছেন, আবার রিজয়েন করছেন। কোনো সমস্যা আছে কোনো? Please wait.
There may be some technical glitches, I think. Shapon da? Yes, Shapon da, you are here and unmute yourself.
স্বপন দা শুনতে পাচ্ছেন? বলুন এবার, আনমিউট করুন।
হ্যালো,
স্যার আপনি ভিডিওটা অফ করুন, নেটওয়ার্ক।
বলুন।
নেটওয়ার্ক সমস্যা।
ভিডিওটা অফ করে দিন।
Very good
ভিডিওটা।
evening to everybody. On behalf of the Department of History and IQAC, Sripat Singh College,
স্যার ভিডিওটা অফ অন করুন।
Department Kalyani University. I would thank resource person Professor Kumar Sannal, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Kalyani, and make meaningful with his session. So many thanks to Professor Dr. Manush Kumar Sannal, Honorable Vice Chancellor, University of Kalyani. I hope again him in our. This evening is very us. Our and popular Singh Kumar Ghosh, Department of History, and shortly keynote address. Very nice and highly informative. For his encouraging lecture, our list. Also, so many thanks person Professor Dr. Soy to join up in our college next time. our university good and nice presentation of a refresher course city where he was enjoy the refresher course. He is many thanks to energy. I hope meet. I would thank our Dr. Shamsuddin. He is not only our guide,
লিক করে গেছেন।
নেটওয়ার্ক প্রবলেম আছে ওর। এমিলি ম্যাডাম শেষ করে দিন ওটাকে ওই করে আপনি।
I think there must be some technical issue or network problem. For that, Sri Shopon Sarkar could not complete the vote of thanks, and on behalf of the department, I would express my regards, and I would thank all the participants, especially who are there with us since 3 p.m. And I hope that tomorrow also we will be able to complete the session successfully. And I thank you all those who have assisted us in this webinar, and I really thankful to our honorable Vice Chancellor, all the resource persons, our principal Dr. Shamsuddin Ahmed, our departmental colleagues, and the members of Sripat Singh College, and to those who have given us the technical assistance. Thank you all. Tomorrow we'll be meeting. We have a meeting on 3 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you. ইউটিউবটা আবার বন্ধ করে দাও, আমি রেকর্ডিং বন্ধ করে দিচ্ছি।
রেকর্ডিং অফ।
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
কাল আবার সেম লিংকে জয়েন করবেন সবাই।